Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.
What I feel this evening is not very clever. It's the very opposite of emptiness. The corny old phrase is the only one I know to say it. My heart is full. With a full heart, with all of it. I thank you.
Well, that's the car. What was left of it after the accident, if it was an accident. The car was meant to be a present. Before he changed his mind, Jake Hannaford was going to give it to the young leading actor of his last movie, John Dale. Hannaford's supposed to have saved him at some earlier date from committing suicide. Or so the story goes. Most of Hannaford's admirers are certain he did not intend to drive his car off that bridge that night. A corny ending, they say. J.J. Hannaford would never be guilty of that. There are other opinions.
John Huston, Peter Bogdanovich, Oya Kodar, Robert Random, Lily Palmer, Edmund O'Brien, Cameron Mitchell, Mercedes McCambridge, Norman Foster, Dennis Hopper, Paul Stewart, Susan Strasberg, Tony O'Selwert, Claude Chabrol, Stefan Audran, Paul Mazursky, Henry Jaglom, George Jessel, John Carroll, Benny Rubin, Peter Jason, Gregory Sierra, Dan Tobin, and Curtis Harrington.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me is Mr. Rob St. Mary.
And the wind cried Mary.
Also with us this week is our old friend Andrew Rausch.
Hey, I'm pleased to be back on. Thank you very much. My third time. Hopefully third time's a charm.
We're kicking off Maudit May this week with a discussion of Orson Welles' Other Side of the Wind, a film some 50 years in the making. It has yet to be completed and released. The film stars John Huston as Jake Hannaford, an aging film director who is working on an artsy-fartsy film to try to stay relevant with New Hollywood, for kids. Most of the film takes place on Hannaford's 70th birthday, where he's surrounded by sycophants, critics, friends, and former friends. Populated by a star-studded cast, the film is a treatise on filmmaking, aging, and machismo. Over the next little bit, we'll talk about what we know about the film and why it's something worth discussing 30 years after Welles' death. We usually begin discussions by asking our guest when they first saw the film and what they thought about it, but in this case, that's not really possible. So, Andrew, I will ask you, when did you first hear about The Other Side of the Wind?
Around the time Citizen Kane really became super relevant again, around 98, when that AFI list came out and it was ranked in the number one film, I went through a period where I really studied a lot of Orson Welles, and I heard about the film then, but only knew the very little that was out there at that time in passing. Then in 2003, there was an article in Cineast magazine about cinematographer Gary Graver, and it had his contact information in there, and I thought I got to contact this guy, and it was through Gary that I really learned about The Other Side of the Wind.
Well, I didn't know about this one, but it's pretty legendary that Welles had a bunch of films, mostly between, I'd say, the late 50s and the early 80s, that he tried to work on and never completed. And I remember seeing, or they were like edited by other people, and, it was kind of like, is this part of the canon? Is this not part of the canon? And I remember the first one I saw of those was when I worked at Thomas Video, and I saw Chimes at Midnight. And I don't even know if that was the authentic version or not. I don't think I was hip to Other Side of the Wind until I think we had Peter Bogdanovich on. And we were talking about St. Jack with him. And all of the connections, obviously, between Peter and Orson Welles. And I think he talked a little bit about working on that, and then how St. Jack came to be. And if you're interested in St. Jack, you should see the film, and it's great, and you should listen to that episode, because Peter Bogdanovich is a fascinating guy to talk to. I think it was that, and then I started to look around and go online and read stuff, and it became this, I'd say, minor obsession of a film that we had yet to see, because there were little bits of it here and there. And it just sounded so huge, and all of the different things that are attached to this film and why it hasn't come out yet. It sounded more fascinating than when Universal took Touch of Evil away and recut it. And then they eventually tried to reconstruct it and put that out. I was just like, wow, this is even crazier.
Yeah, poor Orson Welles. I mean, we talked a lot on the Magnificent Ambersons episode about his career and just how he had so many bad breaks when it came to so many of his films. I mean, Magnificent Ambersons was his second studio film, and already things had started to go wrong for him. And then films that he made, he wasn't necessarily happy with what had happened. I mean, with Macbeth, there was this whole thing about the accents and redubbing the voices and just all of these things over the years. And Other Side of the Wind, I have to say, I really wasn't that familiar with it until quite a few years ago when we did our episode on The Day the Clown Cried. And then somebody had said, oh, well, you should do a April Fool's episode about Other Side of the Wind, as if you had seen that film. And I was like, I remember hearing about Other Side of the Wind, but I'm not exactly sure why. And then I kind of started looking around and started to kind of see some articles here and there. I mean, this was 2011, so as Andrew mentioned, that renaissance of Kane had already kind of come about, and the reappreciation of Welles had really started. The Touch of Evil recut had come out, so there were these articles and books and things about Welles where you could kind of start to glean some information about Other Side of the Wind. And that was the thing too, like you said, Rob, there were little pieces of the film that were out there, and not exactly sure how all this kind of stuff got released. I know for sure there was a AFI tribute to Welles way back when he was obviously still alive and still working on Other Side of the Wind, which started filming in 1970, kind of wrapped around 76, and then the film just fell into this legal morass that we will hear about later as we start talking about the film. But yeah, so he had little clips out there from that. There were clips out from the film and things like Orson Welles, the one-man band, and working with Orson Welles, the Gary Graver documentary, where you got a little bit more of Other Side of the Wind. And obviously we don't have a complete version, and what's out there really in totality only runs about, as far as I could tell, about an hour. So, yeah, not bad. I mean, an hour out of maybe a 2-hour film. Not really sure how this thing is going to cut together, but that's kind of the fascination with this movie, is that we get these glimpses, but we never get the whole piece. And hopefully one of these days we will.
What I've seen was the bit that you sent me, and I think that it was maybe an hour and a half, hour and 45, and it seemed to repeat itself, because I was watching it, I'm like, didn't I just see this? And I'm like, yeah, I did. But it opens with that AFI tribute bit that you were talking about. And I wasn't quite sure what that award show was, but it felt like somewhere in the mid-70s, it's Orson on stage, and he's talking about, thank you for this. It means a lot to me. He's very, he gets kind of choked up about the fact that he's been given this, Lifetime Achievement Award or something. It talks about, why film and why it matters and what he does and why it matters.
This honor I can only accept in the name of all the Mavericks. A maverick may go his own way, but he doesn't think that it's the only way or ever claim that it's the best one, except maybe for himself. And don't imagine that this raggle-taggle gypsyo is claiming to be free. It's just that some of the necessities to which I am a slave are different from yours. As a director, for instance, I pay myself out of my acting jobs. I use my own work to subsidize my work. In other words, I'm crazy. But not crazy enough to pretend to be free. But it's a fact that many of the films you've seen tonight could never have been made otherwise. Or if otherwise, well, they might have been better, but certainly they wouldn't have been mine. The truth is, I don't believe that this great evening would ever have brightened my life if it weren't for this, my own particular contrariety.
And then there are these clips. It seems to be that bit that you sent me, which is probably the best stuff that we could find, feels like it's from some sort of Spanish documentary, because there are points where there's this voiceover that I think is Spanish, basically going by my my rusty old high school Spanish. I couldn't quite figure out exactly what they were saying in the voiceover, but I knew it had something to do with the film.
Having seen the footage, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, I know that there's a film within the film, but I don't necessarily feel like it all. I'm curious to see how it cohesively could go together to become one film. It feels like pieces of different avant-garde films, almost like pieces of a collection of avant-garde student films. They're very well made, the pieces. I'm not 100% convinced that they can be pieced together in a way that is coherent and plays like one movie with a singular rhythm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I got that as well, and that's the thing that's really kind of a nice coincidental irony about this film, is that supposedly the film is about a film that isn't completed, and therefore The Other Side of the Wind is a film that isn't really completed either. So it's kind of interesting how the art itself reflects back on the fact that this film has been held back for almost 40 years and has never been done. And then the other aspect of it, when I was looking at the cutting, and especially when you look at the party scene, because there's really like three big scenes from what I remember you sent me, Mike. One is two guys in a screening room, and they're watching footage, and they're talking back and forth about the director, Hannaford. There's the scene that seems to be the film within the film, which is Ojakodar and this actor and this like simulated sex scene, and they're out at some barn or something, from what I can tell. But the one that reminded me the most of this sort of avant-garde stuff that you were talking about is the piece that I think most people have seen, if they're interested in finding it, is the birthday scene, where it's Peter Bogdanovich and John Huston and all of these extras, and there's all these multiple angles on the scene, and it's all cut. And what you learn is that they have this birthday party for him, and they tell all their filmmaker friends to bring their cameras. So it's all this multi-format stuff. And what it felt like in the cutting, the only thing I can really compare it to that's also a Wells film is like some of the cutting in F for Fake, in that it has this like fast cut and within the scene and shots within the scene itself. So you're seeing it from this angle and that angle, and you're over here. And it feels very loose in that way. It feels almost like a documentary more than a staged film, which were, more formalist filmmaking of what we've seen with Wells in the 40s and in the 50s.
The film kind of has this origin with Ernest Hemingway, and there's a lot of Hemingway-esque stuff that's happening in the movie, and our main character, who's played by John Huston, is kind of a stand-in for Hemingway, but also at the same time kind of a stand-in for Wells. And it's like this whole, as you were saying, art imitating life kind of thing, with how hard drinking Huston was, how hard drinking his character is, how hard drinking Ernest Hemingway was, and going further back from the 70s when this movie was being made. If you go even farther back to like the Maisels had done a little documentary about Orson Welles, and it was basically him telling the story of this movie that he had in his mind, and it would become Other Side of the Wind, kind of based on some changes that were necessary as far as location and everything. This was when he was living in Spain for a while and probably doing some Don Quixote kind of stuff. And he's in Spain, and he's talking about this matador who they describe as a James Dean type troubadour who sets himself apart from other matadors and in front of an audience of wealthy art patrons. And it's interesting to see that James Dean type character turn into this Bob Random, who was the actor that you were talking about in those scenes with Ojakodar, who is kind of a rival of the director. And there's this whole thing about the director always having to sleep with his main actor's wife or girlfriend, and it's almost like he's sleeping with them in order to sleep with the actor that he has in his films. And it's this weird kind of like latent homosexuality thing that's going on. And I know that there were all these accusations about Hemingway, and was he just so macho because he was trying to cover up maybe some hidden proclivities, this kind of stuff. But so fascinating that so many things are just kind of bouncing around in this kind of weird funhouse mirror. I mean, it's not just one mirror. It kind of reminds me of the scene in Citizen Kane where he's walking in front of those mirrors and he's just reflected back into infinity. That's how this movie feels to me, is there's just so many layers and levels to it. I mean, even the whole thing of like this movie is set on, I want to say it's like July 7th or something. I can't remember what the exact date was, but it was the day that Hemingway shot himself. So it's like there are all these multiple connections going on, and it's like you just can keep peeling back and just see more and more of what's real, what's not real, what's a commentary on something else.
This picture we're going to make is against He-Man. Our story is about a pseudo Hemingway, a movie director. Belongs to that league which in Spain they call the macho. That means very masculine.
Muy macho. Yeah.
Muy macho, with a lot of hair on the chest, you see. So the central figure in this story is a fellow with, you can hardly see through the bush of the hair on his chest. And, he was frightened by Hemingway at birth. And this fellow, he's a tough movie director who has killed 3 or 4 extras in every picture. Whatever the picture, his pride that 3 or 4 of them die. That's, that's his stuff. Full of charm. Everybody thinks he's great. So in our story, he's riding around, following a bullfighter and living through him.
His ego.
He's become that lovely young fellow in the beautiful costume, and that fellow's danger is his danger. That fellow's success is his, and so on. But he's become obsessed by this young man who has become, in a way, his own dream of him. He's been rejected by all his old friends. He's finally been shown up to be a kind of voyeur, a peeker, a second-hand guy, a fellow who lives off other people's danger and death.
There's a novel, a Hemingway novel, and Hemingway spent time in Spain, so there's all of this connection even at that level before they even created this, Hemingway character with John Huston, that there's even that connection in that brief little thing that you talk about with the Maysles brothers. The other thing I also saw as interesting, and we'll see what the entire film is like when it comes out, if this is the case, it almost feels like a satire on New Hollywood, because you have this old school director who has come to make a kids film, and what I mean by kids is like a youth picture, is what I'm led to believe from what I've read. And that almost sounds like when Michelangelo Antonioni came over and did Zabriskie Point. It almost seems like Wells is like making a commentary on these old guard directors who were doing, great classical, film work and are now, trying to make the cool hip LSD picture for the kids.
Well, Wells hated Antonioni. And something worth pointing out here also, you brought up the latent homosexuality of the Hannaford character. That is clearly based on Hemingway. And, going back to the film The Spanish Earth, Wells and Hemingway had actually gotten in a fight and come to fisticuffs because Hemingway accused Wells of being homosexual.
I never belonged to his clan because I made fun of him. And nobody ever made fun of Hemingway. But I did. And he took it, but he didn't like me to do it in front of the club. We met in a projection of a movie which he had made and which he wanted me to narrate. And he had written the commentary. This is many years ago. And we hadn't seen each other. This is a dark projection room, and I was reading the text. And I said, is it really necessary to say this? Do you think wouldn't it be better to just see the picture? And things like that. And then I heard this growl from the darkness, Some damn faggot who runs an art theater tried to tell me how to write narration and so on. So I began to camp it up. I thought, if that's what I'm dealing with, I said, oh, Mr. Hemingway, you think because you're so big and strong and have hair on your chest that you got to bully me, you see? So this great figure stood up and swung at me. So I swung at him. Now you have the picture of the Spanish Civil War being projected on a screen, and these two heavy figures swinging away at each other and missing most of the time. The lights came up, and we looked at each other and burst into laughter and became great friends.
I've always found that fascinating. And, Joe McBride, who you've got on the show later on, in his book, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, he actually goes the step as to say that perhaps Welles himself had homosexual tendencies or that were never acted upon or anything. I find the whole thing fascinating, though. That it stuck with Welles. It pissed him off enough that years and years and years later, he writes this into this script. He obviously hated Hemingway. Hemingway was just this larger-than-life macho asshole, apparently. And, I'm just fascinated by the whole thing.
It keeps going. The more you dig, the more you get. The way that the Bogdanovich character is basically, it feels like in a lot of ways he's playing himself. I mean, the scene that we've talked a little bit about is them at this birthday party, and at one point Bogdanovich, who's playing this Otter Lake character, is talking to this critic who's based on Pauline Kael. It's played by, I think, Susan Strasberg.
This is Mr. Hannaford's night. Let's save the questions for him, huh? You two are very close, aren't you?
Yes, I'd like to ask you about that.
Why?
Come on, Otter Lake. Well, why do you think you have to be as rude as he is?
Rude as you are, in print anyway.
I liked your last picture. No, I know that it was repetitive, but for what it was, it worked.
Yeah, well, she wasn't that kind to me in her review. Not that you did me too much harm. I mean, how much harm can you do to the third biggest grosser in movie history? They make that much? How much?
Yes. Did you know that when his own production company goes public, that your friend there stands to walk away with $40 million?
Yeah, and she's going to say that I'm just going to keep on writing that I stole everything from you, Skipper. I'm never going to walk away from that.
And it's funny, though, too, because he calls the Hannaford character Skipper, which was the nickname that Welles had for his friend at Todd, who was named Skipper. So it's just kind of funny that there's even more to that.
Yeah, I mean, Bogdanovich in here, when I saw it, I go, this is perfect, because the original casting, from what I understand, was Rich Little, the comedian and impressionist, who I remember as an impressionist because during the Reagan era, he used to do Ronald Reagan all the time. But I was thinking to myself, I'm like, why would that even work? I'm like, Bogdanovich is perfect because he's a filmmaker. He's talking about being a filmmaker. And in this period in which you watch this scene, that's him, because he had Picture Show and he had Paper Moon and he was huge for a couple of years there in the early 70s. And then it was like he kept trying to go along, and it just seems that, his career never quite got back up to that level. I don't know if it was either through his own moves or studio or whatever, but it's just fascinating to watch because when you look at it, you go, that is just, it's so reflexive. That's the thing that's interesting about watching just even this small little bits in this film, especially when we're talking about Bogdanovich.
Gary Graver told me that one day, and he says in our book, Making Movies with Orson Welles, that one day Rich Little just said, yeah, I'm going home. And he just left. Apparently Welles was really difficult to work with on this film, I will say that. I interviewed Peter Jason for Shock Cinema this year, and Peter Jason's also in the film, and Peter Jason said that Orson screamed through the entire movie. Like, he said, you always wanted to be behind where Orson was at so he couldn't see you, or else he was going to scream at you. And so he just would scream all the time. And I'm trying to remember who the actor was. One of the actors, at the time when he left, he shot his last scenes, was very polite, and Orson has apparently been hateful to him throughout the entire shoot. And then on his last day, he said, if you've got any more questions or you need anything else, get a hold of my agent, care of Peking, China. And then he leaves. And apparently Orson was, he treated this film as our film and involved everybody in it, but apparently he was quite the screamer, and he wanted to stay on his good side.
I've heard different things. I've heard that if you were in his good graces, you were kind of captivated. Like he was kind of the flame that would draw in all the moths kind of stuff. But I can see him being very difficult to work with it as well, and especially for a movie that took 6 years to shoot. I mean, and you mentioned Graver. I know that you have a connection with Graver. I mean, the film kind of ate up Graver's life.
It did, and Graver worked basically for free for all of those years because he had a trust in Welles, and apparently, Welles had a trust in him. They were very close confidants. I will point out that Graver's actually in the film in a couple of places. There are places in the film where actors had to stand in for other actors because Welles didn't have them anymore. And if Welles was able to pull this off in editing, this was going to be amazing. Because there were conversations that were had between characters that were shot 6 months apart, or years apart in different locations. But Graver actually stood in for Bob Random in one of the sex scenes, and he said it was very awkward. He had to get naked and pretend that he was having sex with Oya Kodar. And so there's no doubt that Wells asked a lot of his cameraman. It's not every day that they ask the cameraman to get naked and, grind on a beautiful woman, but it's, it was a very awkward moment, Gary said.
Well, not just grind on a beautiful woman, but grinding on a beautiful woman who happens to be his girlfriend. Like, he was with her at the time. So, like, that adds an extra level of discomfort where it's like, yeah, okay, I got to do a sex scene, but not only do a sex scene with the director's girlfriend. So that'd be kind of odd. Consider at this point, one can understand why he may have been a little unhinged, because his last probably solid release was maybe 10 years earlier. I mean, what? The Trial? I mean, Chimes at Midnight came out, but it was kind of disembodied too. I mean, he was doing other stuff, but his last big theatrical film, had been maybe 10 years or more before. I mean, even Touch of Evil in 58 was kind of disembodied. I mean, he had a lot of problems with Mr. Arkadin. I mean, it just seems like every time this guy was doing something, there was always some sort of issue. And one can understand if you're going to put that much energy and effort into creating something and taking this much time on it, you might be a little upset, or you might be a little focused to the point of obsession.
I hate to say this about such a legend, an iconic figure as Wells, but it does appear that, he brought a lot of the problems onto himself. I mean, he did leave Ambersons. There were several projects he just left undone for other people to finish, or movies that he shot for Don Quixote. He shot for 20 years with 3 different cinematographers. And I take nothing away from him. I don't know if he was afraid on some level that he was never going to be able to accomplish what he had once, it appeared that he was going to be able to accomplish. I mean, when you shoot Citizen Kane at 25, where do you go? But, and I don't even know that it's the fear, or he was just working on too many things at one time. But it's always appeared to me that some of the problems he sort of brought on himself.
That was one of the psychological things. I remember when we got into this before, it may have been on the Ambersons episode, Mike, where we did talk about that with someone, where they were like, probably part of the reason why he never finished all this stuff was out of a deep sense of fear that if he did finish something, it wouldn't measure up to his other work, and therefore it would be even a bigger disappointment, not only to himself, but to people who appreciated him.
Well, it's during this time, too, you talked about, shooting Citizen Kane when you're 25. It's at this point in the early 70s when Pauline Kael publishes an article claiming basically that Wells didn't co-write the script for Kane, and that he is the emperor. He has no clothes. And just the vicious and vitriolic attack that she kind of laid on him over Kane, and just calling him a fraud, and really, basing most of her stuff on what Wells's pretty much sworn enemy John Huston had to say about it. We talked about that relationship in our Rollerball episode a little bit ago. But yeah, just basing everything on Huston and his lens of things, and interviewing people, and then just not using any of their quotes in her article, anything that might have debunked her theory about Wells not having done the work on Kane that he is said to have done. So that's one of the reasons why this Susan Strasberg character is in the film, or the character she plays, Juliette Rich, is in the film as this kind of whipping post, because Kael was trying to, was out for blood when it came to what Wells was doing. And Bogdanovich, kind of came in and wrote a really scathing response to what she had done, but still that kind of stuck. There were a lot of years where it was, did Orson Welles really write this? Did he really do what he was said to have done with Kane? And trying to take that away from him, which is just such a terrible thing, because that was the one thing for sure that he could kind of put up on his mantle, literally with the co-writing Oscar, and she was trying to rip that out of his hands.
Well, I mean, he basically had 2 things in his early go that put him on the map in people's minds. First, obviously, was War of the Worlds, and second was Citizen Kane. So those 2 right there, those are kind of the twin towers that cast their shadow heavy over the rest of his career.
Andrew, do you want to talk about the Oscar that he gave to Graver?
Yeah, there's a lot of dispute over what exactly happened, how it came to be. But at some point, Orson Welles gave his Oscar to Gary Graver. And now, different people have alleged that it was given to him just to hold on to, which is kind of weird. But, and then Gary, swore, and Gary's wife, told me the same thing before she passed away, that Orson had given it to him as a gift, and Orson gave him a lot of things as gifts. He gave him, he had like one of those magic tables where you saw the woman through the table, and Gary had that in his living room, and, all these great props and things, but, and then years later, Wells's daughter found out that Gary tried to sell the Oscar, which is probably kind of unfortunate, but yeah, he tried to sell the Oscar. Apparently he had some money issues, and the daughter stepped in and sued him and took the Oscar back. So it's an interesting story. What about it is 100% true? Nobody knows because they weren't there. Gary was my friend, so I'm obliged to, go with Gary's story. And Gary was a very, very sweet man, but there's no doubt that Orson loved Gary as much as Gary loved him. And I think that's really saying something, because Orson Welles doesn't seem like a man who gave away his love and trust very easily.
Definitely seems like he had been in situations where he tried to put stock in people and then maybe felt like he was being betrayed. And I can see that with some of the, film execs that he had put stock into, some of the actors and just folks around him. And then, if they didn't kind of pull through for whatever reason, he would, just kind of disown them. And I know there was a famous falling out between he and Bogdanovich that happened years later, and which was much more around the St. Jack episode, that we talked about before. He seemed to have believed in Graver all the way, but it's funny because of this whole idea of all these different stories that are around this. And there's a terrific book, and we'll be talking to the author of the book later, Josh Karp, who wrote this book, Orson Welles' Last Film, and so many different perspectives on some of the exact same stories. And there's accusations of one of the backers not giving money, or there's this middleman who didn't give the right funds from one backer to Welles, and he had claimed that he gave all this money. Was that really the case? Was it not? And so many of these instances. And of course, we're dealing with something that's 40-some years in the past. Everybody has their own recollection. Everybody had their own recollection at the time, though, it feels like. And so there's just like this kind of Rashomon thing happening, to make another film reference. And it's appropriate that for this film, we have all these different lenses, and we're seeing Hannaford and all these characters through all of these different lenses. And, we talked a little bit about the editing style for this, and, there's the two very distinct editing styles. There's the art film, the Antonioni, as we've talked about, that's going on, the film within the film, and then the Hannaford stuff outside of the film, which to me, that was the most shocking stuff the first time I watched some of these clips. Once I kind of got into it, I got used to it and was able to accept it, but man, I can see where it might put somebody off just kind of walking in cold and seeing like that birthday scene. It is really a great experiment in editing.
Some of it feels like Tony Scott done better than Tony Scott, you know what I mean? Like it was, the intercutting really preceded the MTV style of, and it's interesting for a guy like Welles at his age, as he's parodying old directors trying to use new techniques. He's doing it himself, basically. But from the scenes that we've seen, I think he pulls them off pretty well.
Looking at it and you saying it being MTV style, that was one of the things I put down in my notes, because that party scene, like we've discussed, that one with all the multiple formats and how it cuts between here and this, like it's totally different from all of the other setups and editing that we're used to with his earlier work. Like his earlier work is much more, classically set. And then, like I said, the only thing I can compare it to that's a total film is F for Fake, because it's the only one that goes in that kind of style and is willing to like break the traditions of that time. It really is an interesting thing to watch. I wish there was a better version of it. I'm sure it looks nicer and you can figure out at times what's going on a little bit more if it was a cleaner image. And that's the one thing that was kind of holding me back sometimes. I'm kind of like, it's a little murky. What am I looking at?
I got lucky. I think the version that I got to see was the clearest version there is, and those were owned by Graver. You know, and I remember the day that he sat me down and he screened this footage for me. I felt like, oh my God, I'm watching the Holy Grail, you know, and I didn't really know what the hell it was I was seeing, and they don't play together like one film, as I said, but, you know, but I knew that I was witnessing something that was different and something that was extraordinary, especially for 1976.
I think that editing style, too, also is going to help when it comes to the whole idea of stitching together all of these disparate scenes that were shot over a period of 6 years. I mean, it was funny, you know, Robbie brought up F for Fake, and I can definitely see that, but it was interesting kind of comparing it to even filming Othello, the little documentary about Othello that we watched for the Othello episode, and how he was kind of cutting himself in as the question asker to McLeamore, and I can't remember the other gentleman's name, but just the way that he was cutting himself in with these guys, and they're obviously in one interview, he's, you know, shooting this other stuff himself, probably actually shot by Graver, if memory serves, and just how he's, you know, using editing to tie these things together, and he does that a lot with F for Fake, and I can see him really doing that with this film, is being able to use those quick cuts and those flashes of image in order to help tie together things that were shot in 1970 with things that were shot in 1976. I mean, there's the whole thing of, you know, Bogdanovich actually plays two characters in the film. He plays a film critic along with Joe McBride, who we'll hear in just a moment here, and then also plays Brooks Otterlake. And I don't think that they really had that much of a care for it. I think that they were going to double up with the original character that Bogdanovich was playing, and the rest they could do. You know, you mentioned, Andrew, the whole idea of Graver doubling for Bob Random. There was going to be so much doubling, or there was so much doubling of these characters and just, you know, backs of heads or parts of bodies, and just kind of the suggestion that these things are happening at the same time. I mean, you only had John Huston for a little bit of time. It wasn't like he was there for 6 years. I mean, the guy was cranking out movies the entire while. So you shot this whole movie around a character who you only had for a limited amount of time, and then it was a matter of what could Wells get away with when it came to shooting around him and getting these schedules to work. And, you know, I think there were only a few people that were there constantly, Graver being one of them, and just, you know, sometimes people would drop in, fall out, and what could you do in order to make this movie work? And ultimately, the question I think we're going to ask ourselves is, will this movie work at all?
Well, that's the thing that's funny about him filling in for other roles. Reminds me of obviously A Local Boy and Sam Raimi and his use of the quote-unquote fake Shemp, where he would get people and shoot backs of their heads or various things to stand in for characters that had disappeared during the shooting. I mean, mostly of Evil Dead, the original Evil Dead. So it's kind of interesting that we'll see if it's as seamless, I think, at times as what Sam was able to do by, you know, dressing up his little brother and putting him in certain scenes.
All right, so let's go ahead and take a break and play an interview with our old friend Joe McBride, the author of Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, after these brief messages.
Howdy, folks. Like blood, violence, freaks of nature.
You come to the right place. My name is Gary, and I'm your guide to Cinema Beef Podcast. Every episode, we not only deliver film reviews, we also dismantle some of your favorite and most hated films, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse.
Hey, you shut your face! If we want to hear you talk, I will shove my arm up your ass and work your mouth like a puppet.
All right, calm down. Every show I hope to have a new co-host, podcasters and listeners alike. That's right, I'm talking to you people. I take all comers.
You're sluts.
That's not very nice. The only rules, well, let's ask the best cooler in the business.
All you have to do is follow 3 simple rules. 1, never underestimate your opponent. Expect the unexpected. 2, take it outside. Never start anything inside the bar unless it's absolutely necessary. And 3, be nice.
So join the insanity and please vent your frustrations. I'm available on TalkShoe, iTunes, and Stitcher Smart Radio. Remember, here at the Cinema Beef Podcast, if you got beef, I've got the grinder.
hello from Cinema Detroit, Metro Detroit's only truly independent cinema. We deliver an eclectic mix of current indie, genre, cult, and classic movies in the heart of the city. Like a sommelier choosing wine for his or her guests, we handpick our slate of films, many of which are exclusive to the metro area, the state of Michigan, or occasionally the entire Midwest region. Cinema Detroit features a unique setting in a former school and a warm hometown atmosphere, including always fresh popcorn, Detroit-made Faygo soda, and other locally created treats. Please visit our website, cinemadetroit.com, for the latest features and showtimes. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Tumblr. We look forward to seeing you soon at 3420 Cass Avenue in Midtown Detroit, 48201.
Crisis for the geek kind. Top geek officials admit they underestimated the hipsters' defense capability. Join the geek revolution and save the galaxy. Geeks from all over the globe are joining up to fight for the future. They're doing their part. Are you? Want to know more? Join Weeby Geeks and the Geek Revolution and save the world. Service guarantees citizenship. Listen to Weeby Geeks podcast on iTunes and Stitcher or online at WeebyGeeks.net. Weeby Geeks, your voice for the Geek Revolution. Want to know more?
Tell me about the first time that you ended up meeting with Orson Welles.
Yeah, well, I was 19 when I started writing my first book on him, which was called Orson Welles, and it was published in 1972 by the British Film Institute. It was a critical study in the Cinema One series, which was a very good series of, works on different directors and genres and things. And I started in 1966, so I had the book almost finished by 1970. I was working already on a book on John Ford with Michael Willington, which finally came out in 1974. So I had made plans to come to Hollywood to interview John Ford. I had talked him into doing an interview, which was unusual, and I was very excited. He's my favorite director of all time, and he's also Welles' favorite director. And so I flew to Hollywood in August of 1970, and I didn't think that Welles was in the country. This was a time when Welles was kind of out of the public spotlight as far as we knew in America, at least. And you wouldn't hear much about him. The only way to sort of track him was to look in Variety in small pieces where they would say he's in Zagreb doing some dubbing or something, or, some kind of obscure items like that. I've been publishing chapters of my book in magazines like Film Quarterly and Sight and Sound, and I've been sending those issues to his attorney in New York, Arnold Weisberger. It's the only way I knew how to possibly get hold of Welles, and I never heard back from them, so I didn't assume that he had read them, but he had been reading them, it turned out. And so when I got to Hollywood, I had my appointment with Ford. I was an admirer of Peter Bogdanovich. I had seen Targets in 1968. I was at the Chicago convention, Democratic convention, protesting, and took a break to see Targets downtown with a very small audience, and was very impressed with this terrific debut film of his. Also, he was doing the kind of things that I was doing, but he had done it before me, and he was interviewing a lot of famous directors, and I was kind of modeling my career partly on his, as somebody who would get these interviews and get to know these directors. But he had already done his book on John Ford and all this. So I called him, got his phone number from Larry Edmonds' bookshop. Milton Lubavitsky, who was the proprietor, gave me his phone number. So I called Peter, and he said, I'm on the other line with Orson. Could you hold on? So I was really stunned. And he came back a couple minutes later. He said, Orson would like to have you call him. And he gave me a phone number, and he said, call him tomorrow at this time. And I was really kind of floored, and I didn't realize Welles was in Hollywood. And so then Peter and I chatted, and I made an appointment to go see him at his house, which I did before I met Welles. I went to Peter's house for an evening, and he was very generous in sharing his information on Wells and Ford because there were a lot of mysteries at that time surrounding both of them, and he cleared up most of the mysteries. And so I called Wells, and he said, "We're about to start shooting a film. Would you like to be in it?" That was the first thing he said. And I was really kind of amazed because I wasn't an actor, had never acted before, unless you count being an altar boy for 3 years as a Catholic kid, which is a form of theater. So all I could think of saying was a kind of a stupid question. I said, "Is this going to be a feature-length film?" Because I couldn't imagine I would be in a feature film by Orson Welles. And he laughed and said, "Well, we certainly hope so." And it turned out to be not such a stupid question in the long run because it's still not a feature-length film. We certainly hope so. Anyway, so he said, come see him. And so he invited me to his home. He had been renting a home in Beverly Hills. And so that Friday I went to his home, had lunch with him, and we talked for about 3 hours, and it was very wide-ranging talk where I was able to ask him all kinds of questions about his work, and it was very interesting, and he was very cordial. And when I walked in, he had a book of mine on his mantelpiece, Persistence of Vision, which I'd also sent because it had a section on him. I'd written pieces on Ambersons and Kane and Chimes of Midnight. He said, "Finally, I meet my favorite film critic." So I was completely floored. This was like a Walter Mitty experience for a young film buff. I was only 23. But that week I met Ford, Wells, and Renoir, and Peter Bogdanovich. So I met my three favorite directors and Peter Bogdanovich. And also I tried to get a hold of Hitchcock, and he had called my hotel and said I could come see him, but the hotel screwed up and I didn't get the message, so I could have met Hitchcock that week too. So I kind of thought every week in Hollywood is going to be like this, and I didn't realize this was kind of the pinnacle, and this is the ultimate week that I ever had. So by Sunday, I was acting in the Wells film, The Other Side of the Wind. He started shooting that Sunday, and then I went home to Wisconsin, and I came back about a year later. He called me back for more shooting, and then I moved to California, and he would call me back periodically for more shooting. We did a lot of shooting. It went on for 6 years, and so I was in this film for 6 years.
The one thing that I seem to hear whenever people talk about Orson Welles was that he had this air about him and was able to kind of bring you into his world and make you kind of almost like a co-conspirator. Is that what your feeling was when you were working with him?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good description, although since, I'm a critic and the book was almost finished, I added a chapter about working with him, but I always, want to maintain my critical distance in a sense from the subject as well. It's a balancing act in a way when you're acting in a film for somebody and then you're writing a critical study of him. But if you read that book, I'm critical of a number of the films. And over the years, I've gotten less critical of a couple like Macbeth. I didn't like much at all, but that was the chopped up and redubbed version that was in circulation at the time. Since then, they've restored it, so I now think it's a really terrific film. But I've never been particularly high on Othello, for example. So one time when we were shooting The Other Side of the Wind, I heard Wells in the other room saying to somebody, Joe would like Christopher Plummer. He doesn't like my Shakespearean performances either. So I hastened over to his side and I said, well, that's not really true. I said, I think your performance as Falstaff is your greatest performance in Chimes of Midnight. But I admit that I think you were miscast in Othello, and I think you were good in Macbeth, but, if you criticize any of his performances, he didn't like that. So it made for some prickly moments occasionally because I was not a yes man. I was a little in awe of him, I have to admit, when I first met him, but I was young and the whole world of professional filmmaking was new to me, and he was a great idol of mine. But very quickly, he seemed very human and very down to earth, and it was very exciting. And one thing that people say who worked for him, we all put up with all kinds of long hours and hardships, and we didn't get paid, and one thing or another. The reason people do that with Wells, no matter who they are, whether they're humble actors like me or non-actor in my case, or great actors like John Gielgud or Jean Moreau or somebody like that, is that it's the greatest creative experience of your lifetime to work with them. And you know that when you're doing it, so you'll put up with an awful lot of hardship and sometimes temperament. You know, he could be temperamental. He was actually very nice to the actors most of the time. He believed in being kind and warm toward the actors because he felt the actors are the most important people in a film, and they're very sensitive creatures. Although, in my case, he was bullying for about 3 years. He wanted me to be kind of in this state of intimidation as I played a young film critic, historian, kind of a spoof of myself. And he, since I was not an actor, he gave me all the line readings. I was grateful for that. And he very rigidly controlled my performance. He told me exactly how to move and where to move. And I didn't mind that because it was a relief in a way because he was such a great director of actors. And but he did involve me in the writing of my part. There's a film you can see online that the Maysles brothers did of him in 1966 where he's describing the project that became The Other Side of the Wind. And he said he was going to do an experimental film in which the actors would sort of make up their own lines and help write the film. And they were going to be playing versions of themselves. And he said it was something that hadn't been done before. And in my case, certainly he did that. We would talk for an hour or so before every scene that I was in, and he would say, what would you say here and what would you say there? And then I would give him some ideas, and then he would make them more comical or more absurd, and then we kind of kicked them around. And so we really collaborated on the dialogue, and then he would write the final version of it and type it up, and then I'd have to say it exactly. I couldn't change things or improvise. But so there was a sense of creative participation. So you did feel like a conspirator in a sense. Also, these were guerrilla filmmaking tactics, shooting on a shoestring. I mean, literally a home movie because he was working in his home quite often. We worked in a studio for a while, but it was really shoestring production. And, you know, there were great actors, John Huston, Mercedes McCambridge, Edmund O'Brien, all kinds of people, and a very good cameraman, Gary Graver. But the crew is all basically 19-year-old guys and a couple of women. And so it's quite a motley potpourri of people. And we all had this sense that we were doing something very special.
Now, you said it took 6 years for your part of the filming to be complete. And I have to ask, at the end of the 6 years, how did you kind of know that it was complete?
Well, that's a good question. There was no moment when he said, that's it, folks. Actually, it was not just my part, but the whole shooting took 6 years. And I was in the shooting until the very end. And although I wasn't in every phase of the shooting, I counted I was in 45 days of shooting over 6 years. But it just all came to an end, and I don't know how we found out. I guess Gary Graver, who became a good friend of mine, the cameraman, I was always getting information from him like, okay, that's it, and we've shot almost everything. And there are only a couple shots that were not filmed that still remain to be shot. Those can be done with CGI or some other techniques. But it just sort of came to a stop. Wells would shoot whenever he got money, and then, you know, we wouldn't hear from him for a few months or a year even, and then suddenly we got the word that more shooting was going to take place. There was a lot of shooting in the spring of 1975 at Peter Bogdanovich's home in Bel Air. Peter was off in Europe doing Daisy Miller, and Wells kind of took over the house, and so almost every night after work at Variety, I'd go up there and he'd be shooting the film, and he would find things for me to do in the film, which was wonderful.
Tell me about your character, Mr. Pister.
The character I play is a kind of buffoonish version of who I was back when I was a young cineast back in 1970. When I started, I was very earnest, and I was very skinny and young and naive and kind of intimidated by everything. Although I was a newspaper reporter and I've been a journalist since 1960, so I actually was a strange mixture of kind of intimidation by famous people in the film business, but I was asking tough questions, which I'd been accustomed to be doing as a reporter. And so I would ask him and Ford and other people fairly blunt, tough questions. Sometimes I would get people irritated with the questions. And that became part of the character as well. So he may seem like a kind of a nebbish, but he's asking some really incisive questions. And there's one question. I'm supposed to be following John Huston around, who's the lead actor in the film, playing Jake Hannaford, who's a legendary old Hollywood director who's kind of, as Wells said, it's not him, but it's more like John Ford or Howard Hawks or Henry Hathaway, somebody like that, a kind of a macho old-time director who's fallen on tough times. And one reason Wells made the film was that he was bothered by the fact that in the new Hollywood of what we call the Easy Rider era, the old directors were having a hard time getting work. And it bothered me a lot, too, because I was very upset that, Ford didn't get to make a feature film after Seven Women, and he tried for 5 years, for example. And it was a real terrible thing that these people were shunted aside, and so that was part of the story. And so I'm following Huston around, asking him intrusive film buff questions, basically, and Wells was sort of working off some of his vexation with interviewers asking him either silly or penetrating questions. He didn't like either kind of question, and he would be pestered by, a lot of interviewers, and so it's kind of like a duel between him and the interviewers. So Huston's character was sort of doing that to me. He was kind of trying to blow me off most of the time, and so I would ask him questions. For example, Wells told me actually the character was mostly modeled on Hemingway, which I figured out pretty quickly anyway, because it started out it was called The Sacred Beasts, and he started writing that in 1961, right around the time Hemingway killed himself. And it was, back then, it took place around the bullfights, and it was an old macho writer, apparently, followed by aficionados and, following the bullfights. And then he changed it to a movie director. And I knew that Hemingway's father had killed himself, and at the end of The Other Side of the Wind, the Huston character basically kills himself. He drives off in a Porsche like James Dean and gets killed in a drunken car crash. And so I thought I would ask Hannaford if his father's suicide influenced his film work, which is a very, personal question. And Wells thought that was great, and he kind of twisted it around a little bit. I didn't realize at the time that Wells thought his own father had committed suicide, and he felt responsible for it. This came out later. His father basically drank himself to death. He was an alcoholic, and he died alone in a hotel room in Chicago. And Wells, who was a teenager at the time, had been persuaded by Roger Hill and his wife Hortense, who were his, not exactly guardians, but Roger was the headmaster of his boarding school, and they were taking care of Orson, who had a kind of difficult youth, and they had persuaded Wells to ignore his father in what we now call tough love, leave him alone for a while and see if he'll shape up. And then he drank himself to death. So Wells wrote an article for French Vogue late in his life in which it was supposed to be part of his autobiography, where he said he had killed his father. And he gave an interview where he said he had always felt he had killed his father, and he felt this terrible guilt. And he said he didn't believe in psychiatry and the whole notion of getting over your guilt. He said you have to live with it. And I didn't know any of this, but this didn't deter Wells from putting this in the film. And in the original scene that we shot, this question gets me thrown out of Hannaford's car as we're driving along. I'm interviewing him with a tape recorder, and I get tossed out of the car for asking this indelicate question. Although in the rough cut that I've seen, I get tossed out of the car for a different reason, but we'll see how it turns out in the editing.
Now, when you were first playing this character, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't Bogdanovich playing another critic alongside of you?
Yeah, I was just reading the Wikipedia entry in the film, which I don't know who put this in there, but it's very detailed, and some of the details are wrong. They get one thing wrong about me. They say that Bogdanovich was playing a critic, and then he became a famous director, and so he was recast as a famous director. And then I stepped into the role that he was playing. That's not true. What happened was the first day of shooting, Peter and I were both playing film historians, critics. He was a little older than I was, and he was kind of slicker and all that. And he was supposed to be a guy who was doing a book with Hannaford, just like Peter was doing a book with Orson Welles, which later became This Is Orson Welles. And so he was a more ambitious kind of hustler type character. So he and I were like a comic team of bickering film historians, and he was casting the Last Picture Show at the time, and he was about to go to Texas to start shooting the film. And as we all know, that made him a famous director within about a year and a half or so, or about a year even. And at that point, Welles started thinking of him differently because he became kind of more of a peer of Welles and became very successful at a time when Welles was struggling outside the system. So he recast Peter playing this hotshot young director whose mentor is Jake Hannaford, and it became this Falstaff-Hal relationship, which is reflected in a lot of Welles's films. As we know, it's often about, it's a male friendship of two guys, sometimes one who's older and more powerful, and a younger one who's sort of his rival or friend or whatever. Is a conflicted relationship, and usually the younger man betrays the older man, and that's repeated in The Other Side of the Wind. And so Peter was playing that part. That part had been played by Rich Little, the Impressionist, and I was in some scenes with Rich Little. So in the interim, this took a couple of years before Peter got the part, Little was doing every line in the voice of some impression that he was doing, like Jimmy Stewart or John Wayne or Cary Grant or whatever, which was a conceit that I thought wouldn't really work. It might be funny for one scene or two, but it wouldn't work for a whole film. And he was not, he was a very, very talented comedian and impressionist, but he wasn't really an actor, So I thought this is maybe not going to work. And then Little left the film. There are conflicting versions of this. One story is that he just showed up. Gary Graver told me he showed up on the set one day, and he was carrying a suitcase, and he said, "Well, it's been great working with you guys. I got to go. See you later." And he just walked off. And Gary and Orson were just sort of sitting there stunned. And in Rich Little's defense, he had a lot of nightclub engagements and things and television contracts that he had to fulfill, and he couldn't just sit around in Arizona forever and make this film. And so he wasn't abandoning them, for no reason. But that's how Welles experienced it. And then there are other versions that Welles fired him. And I think Welles was secretly happy he left because his role wasn't working out, although he was a very nice fellow. So then he gives it to Peter. But what happened then was we had to reshoot some of those early scenes that Peter and I had done. And they cast a guy named Howard Grossman, who was a production assistant on the film, to play the part that Peter had played. So we redid all the scenes we did the first day, and some of them we didn't do over again, but like the interview scenes in the car, we kept shooting those. We did those a couple times, and Huston was never in the car. And the way Welles shot his films after he left Hollywood was, there'd be 8 people in a shot, 6 of them with their back to the camera, and that meant that only 2 of the actors were really there and everybody else was a stand-in. And Welles kind of loved to do that, but it was out of necessity. So he would film us in the car and then later do some shots with John Huston driving the car, which became sort of a nightmarish joke in its own right. This is one of the great stories of the film, is that Huston hadn't driven a car since 1933, and he had run over a woman on Sunset Boulevard and killed her. He was acquitted, but apparently he had had a couple drinks, and so the story was that MGM and his father had worked out a deal with the DA that Huston would leave the country for a year, and he would get off. And he never drove a car again. And I innocently once said to him, "How come you don't drive a car?" And he said, "Oh, I like to drink too much." And so Wells said, "John, you got to drive this car." And he said, "Oh, okay, he'd do anything for us." And so they got in the car. It was Wells, Huston, Gary Graver, somebody else, and Larry Jackson, who was a PA. I guess he was holding the sound equipment. He was hanging off the back of the car, and John Huston immediately drives the wrong way on a freeway. And they were kind of swerving around the freeway, and Larry Jackson told Josh Karp, he said he could see the obituary in the paper that, Huston and Wells killed in car crash, and Larry wouldn't even be mentioned in the story. Fortunately, Huston managed to drive off the road, and they all survived. But that was one of the great stories of the film. But anyway, so we would do these scenes that are still have to be kind of stitched together. That's one of the problems in the post-production. I think it'll all go together, but it was all done. I mean, Othello was shot that way, for example. Mr. Arcotton, this is not new for Wells to shoot things all over the place with different people in different locations and using doubles and stand-ins and things like that.
How much of that, though, was in Wells's head versus actually being documented?
It was pretty much all in his head. There was a script. The first day of shooting, we all, as I said, we would talk through the scene, and then he would type up some pages. So, we all just did some scenes with, it was just Peter and me and some extras doing some scenes. I think we did 27 shots that day, which is a lot of shots. But when I came back a year later, things were more organized, and there was a shooting script that I was given that was mimeographed and everything. And the film within the film, which is an important part of The Other Side of the Wind, it's John Huston's character's film within the film that's unfinished, and he's showing it at his birthday party. The film takes place at his 70th birthday party, and they're showing parts of his unfinished film to try to raise money to finish it. So it's kind of a life imitating art, or art imitating life situation. That was not really described. It would just say film within the film sequence here, So that was either in Wells's head or in some kind of script pages that I never got to see. But so much of it was in his head, and he was known for that anyway, that he could keep all the continuity and all the complicated shots in his head. He did that on Othello, which is a good analogy for this film because it took 4 years to shoot in different locations, different countries, and he would remember how the shots matched in terms of choreography and cutting and lighting and everything. And I was there when he told the script girl not to talk to him on The Other Side of the Wind. He actually had a script supervisor, and she tried to correct him on some point, as they do, and that's their job. And he barked at her, "Don't talk to me anymore," And so she didn't talk to him about that stuff, but she was keeping notes. And she continued on the film, Sally Stringer, and she was an important member of the crew. But so he was doing it without a script supervisor, which is very unusual.
It must have been a little difficult for you. I mean, you come into this film at 19, and you're still shooting it when you're 25.
Well, actually, I was 23 when I started. I started writing the book when I was 19, but I'd been working on the book for 4 years, so I was 23 when I started, and then so I would have been, 29, I guess, when I did my last shooting for the film. And it all takes place in one day, so yeah, it's. I think you're going to ask about continuity there. That was part of the challenge. I was growing a lot, and I came back after a year the first time, and I walked in. I'd gained 25 pounds. I was very thin originally, and then I kind of filled out. And Wells said, "Oh my God, he's matured," and he thought it was funny. And he told me things like to wear, to not shave on days when I shot, so that my cheeks would look more hollow on camera. And that was a trick that I'm sure he used back in his youth, to look, because he always struggled with his weight. But I just tried to stay in character for all those years. One thing that was difficult was when I went to Bogdanovich's home the first week before I'd met Wells, I had been to a screening of Fellini's Satyricon that afternoon. I ran out of paper, and I still do this. It's a habit I have. I scribble notes on my wrist if I'm out of paper, and I think it goes back to my old newspaper days. And Peter thought this was very funny. I had stuff on my wrist, and he told Wells, and so Wells insisted that I write notes on my wrist, and we had a whole scene where we talked about that in the film, which Peter's character was saying, "You have stuff on your wrist. What is that?" And so Wells said, "Write things like mother fixation and Oedipus complex, and all the things that he thought serious critics would say." And so I had to keep doing that every day for 6 years. And then I remember the first day he was very paternal. He said, "Go in the bathroom and scrub your wrist and get all that stuff off your wrist." Like he was really micromanaging everything. And so every time I came back, I had to put all that stuff on my wrist, which got kind of irritating after a while.
You were also part of the small committee of people, or maybe you felt like an individual that were trying to help bring the film to fruition. What was your kind of role in that?
Well, it was unofficial because, Wells lived till 1985, so there was 9 years of his life where he was still shooting other films. The Other Side of the Wind really is not his last film. He was shooting The Dreamers and The Magic Show and other projects, and he finished one film after Other Side of the Wind, which was filming Othello. It's a documentary played in theaters, and so he did a lot of work while he was, the film was stymied at that point by legal and financial disputes. And so I wasn't obviously trying to interfere with that. But once he died, we all, all the people who worked in the film put a lot of energy and love and care into the film. And Gary Graver, the poor guy, his whole life was wrapped around this film. He had dedicated everything to the film. He used to tell me, "I'm still working for Orson." This is long after Wells had died, and he wasn't joking. He was actually working for Orson. He would be going to the lab and doing stuff. And so I would, from time to time, when I met some producer like Roger Corman, I worked for him, and I said, I steered Truffaut and Jean Moreau to Roger because he was releasing Bergman and Fellini. So I said to Truffaut, he was looking for a distributor for The Story of Adele H., and I said, "Go with Roger Corman." So he did, and then I told Moreau, and he picked up her film Lumiere. So I said to Roger, "You're doing all these art films and getting Oscars," and he was very proud of them. And I said, "How about The Other Side of the Wind? You could finish it and get this thing out." And he said, "Well, I would love to, but I know that the day the film opened at noon, I'd be hit with 3 lawsuits, from people claiming to own it. And unless that would be sorted out, I couldn't really get involved." And so I'd have these kind of discussions trying to get people interested, and it really didn't go anywhere. But in the 90s, I was thinking, well, somebody's got to do something. So I got a little more active. Touch of Evil had come out with the restored version. The producer, Rick Schmidlin, had this bright idea of taking Wells's 58-page memo that he wrote after seeing the Universal. They took the film away from him and recut it, and Wells wrote this fantastically detailed memo about how to improve the film, and they kind of ignored most of his suggestions, but Rick had this brainstorm. You could take the memo and try to implement the cuts. So he hired the great editor Walter Murch, who's also a great sound editor. He's the person for whom the term sound designer was created on the Conversation. And so Walter Murch, Universal got behind this, and they made 50 changes, all based on the memo. They couldn't make every change because they have some of the footage that was cut out of the film because there was a preview version, but they don't have all the footage, and there is no director's cut that exists. So they improved it a lot, but they couldn't, totally go back to whatever Wells's cut might have been. But anyway, the film did very well, got great reviews, and it made a couple $1 million at the box office. So suddenly there was a precedent that an old Orson Welles film could make money if it was restored. And here was an old film, old in the sense that it was made some years before, but it was unreleased. And it seemed like a no-brainer to me to have the people were restoring The Wild Bunch or things like that, and why not restore a film that had never been seen except in fragments? So suddenly people got interested, and Gary had been trying for years to get people to do things with the film, and he had put together a rough cut of sorts. It was about 95 minutes long, and rough cut is maybe not a good word for it. It was more like an assembly of scenes. Orson had edited 41 minutes of scenes. He did them really the way he wanted, and he put some music on it. But it was a work print because he and Gary had basically stolen the work print from the lab in Paris when they were having a dispute with the Iranian investors, which is another wild story. They loaded this all in a Volkswagen and smuggled it to America. And so Gary had taken those 41 minutes and whatever else he had and cobbled together a version. I thought it was a mistake to show that to investors because it looked like a sort of half-assed complete film that wasn't really complete, you know. And I said, why don't we re-edit this thing and cut it down to about 60 minutes and keep the 41 minutes and then maybe 20 minutes of good stuff and not purport that this is the whole film, but it's just kind of like a bunch of scenes, and he wouldn't do that. So we showed the longer version to a lot of investors who were kind of baffled by it, basically. But I had a friend who was working for Showtime, the cable network, and Susan Katz, and she took it to Showtime and said, there's this Orson Welles film that you guys should look at. And they looked at it, and Gary had talked to them some time before, and he hadn't gotten them to commit. But in the meantime, you know, the Touch of Evil thing had happened. And so anyway, Matthew Duda was this executive at Showtime, and he understood the potential of this film. And Gary and I made a deal with Matthew Duda. And I should say that for a long time there was a kind of an impasse between Oya Kodar, who's Welles's companion and mistress and collaborator on the other side, when she owned his rights to the film, which he left in his will. But the other half of the film, or the other portion of the film, was owned by Mehdi Boucherie, who was an Iranian, who was a brother-in-law of the late Shah. And Boucherie owned a film company in Paris that was connected with the Iranian government, so they had invested a lot of money in the film, so it was very complicated. And Boucherie and Welles had fallen out because every time Welles needed more money, Boucherie would make him surrender some of his percentage of ownership, and so it got down to something like 80% Boucherie and 20% Welles, which really bothered Welles, you know. So I thought the solution to this would be somehow to broker a deal in which each side would get half and, you know, settle and cash out. And Gary acted like Henry Kissinger doing shuttle diplomacy. He was going to Paris, and he talked Boucherie into doing that, and he talked Oya into doing that. So I kind of arbitrarily said, we'll give each of them $1 million, and we'll take $1 million for post-production, and it would take a year and a half, and it was a very rough estimate. And I wrote a memo in which I detailed how we could finish the film, and I estimated very conservatively, based on the Touch of Evil success, that we could gross easily $7 million, you know, theatrically a couple million, and then sell it to cable companies around the world. And you know, it's kind of a no-brainer. You can make a profit, a modest profit, but you can make a profit. And so the Showtime went along with it, and they agreed to put up $3 million. And I was going to produce the film at one point with Rick Schmidlin, and then he dropped out. He kind of lost interest in the film. So it was down to me producing the film, and I wanted Peter Bogdanovich to do the post-production because he's a very fine director, and Welles had apparently asked him to finish the film if anything happened to him, so Peter had agreed to do that. And Oya had been with me in meetings, and everything seemed fine. And then Peter and Oya, the minute the deal was made, fired me from the film. They both, you know, thought they didn't need me anymore, which was very short-sighted. You know, I thought this is unfair, but I didn't want to make any trouble for the film, so I just bowed out and let them do their thing. And then the deal collapsed immediately, almost immediately, because Beatrice Wells's daughter, started raising objections. And she has a history of interfering with various projects of her father's, even though she had no ownership of the other side of the wind. She inherited his artist's rights in France, author's rights, they call it, which means that the author has control of cutting and things like that. Even it's not something we have in America, but they have it in Europe. So she had some leverage in that regard, so she had to be dealt with. So she raised objections, and so the whole Showtime deal collapsed. And, I'm sitting on the sidelines for years, and I kept hearing, it was off, it was on, it was off, it was on, and Peter and Oya were feuding, and, apparently there was a dispute between them about who was going to get the final cut. Peter wanted the final cut, and Oya wanted the final cut, and, they both have an emotional investment in the film, and they both had financial interests, and, it was just sort of a never-ending situation, and Beatrice was involved. And finally, Philip, Jen Rimsa, and Jen's Kothner Call, two European producers, came into the picture and managed to talk Oya and Boucherie's family, since he had died in the interim, into cashing out and allowing them to control the editing, which was very smart because, you're not going to be able to resolve the battle between Oya and Peter and all that. So you need some kind of third party to finish the film. So they got control of that, and Frank Marshall is involved. He's as you know, a very famous Hollywood producer, worked a lot with Spielberg, and he was a producer on the other side of the wind when he was very young. He was a line producer. So that's where it's at the moment, and they announced it in the New York Times last fall that they had reached this deal. As far as I understand, they're currently setting up post-production, and it's a complicated job to finish the film. It's going to take a while to finish the film, and I think people shouldn't be too impatient about it. It should be done properly.
Do you think it's really going to happen this time?
This is the best chance the film will ever have, I guess. I mean, some people used to say a few years ago this film will never come out until everybody who worked on it is dead, which is sobering for me to hear, because I'm one of the few surviving cast members. There are a few. A number of the crew people are alive because they were quite young at the time, but a lot of the cast were older people who've died. The implication being that, it would only happen if people who have a vested interest in it were no longer causing trouble. It's a little easier to finish it with Wells not being around. Ironically, when the artist is not around, it's a little easier to deal with him, But I think that this is a very good chance. Philip and Jens, who I've talked to repeatedly, are very shrewd and good businessmen and very, diplomatic. And Frank Marshall is very, extremely knowledgeable and sophisticated Hollywood producer, and he cares about the film because he worked on it, and he understands the quality of the film, and he's an old associate of Peter Bogdanovich, and Frank is a very diplomatic fellow, and so they managed to get Beatrice Wells on board, which was quite a thing, and she's now enthusiastic, I'm told, about helping finish the film, and they've got Oya and Peter, and everybody is on board, and the Boucherie family are happy, and it's just a question of so many things have happened over the years, as Josh Karp's wonderful book documents, that something always seems to happen, and I hope nothing bad happens, but I've been saying, and I've heard this, Josh told me he's heard this from a number of people who worked on the film, that I won't really believe it until I'm sitting in a theater somewhere and the curtains open and the film flashes up on the screen. But somebody else said, well, I won't believe it until the end title flashes off the screen and the film stops. So I guess I have to take that, and I think even Oya said that at some point. So I guess, we've been burned so many times that you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But I really think that these people are serious and capable, and have the best interests of the film at heart and will finish it in the best possible way. So I think it's, I'm pretty guardedly optimistic about it, but I don't want to just say, oh, it's all a fait accompli or anything like that.
We're back, and we're talking about Orson Welles' Other Side of the Wind. Now, this isn't an April Fool's joke like our Day the Clown Cried episode. Sorry to tell you, but that's a fake if you didn't know that. But we're discussing another film that has yet to be released, but it's my understanding that it could be on the way. Is that true, Mr. Mike?
That's what they say. I mean, it was funny. Andrew, you said that you interviewed Peter Jason earlier this year, and you hooked me up with some of his contact information. So I sent him an email, and then next thing I know, I'm getting a phone call from this guy who says, oh, you requested an interview with Peter Bogdanovich. And I'm like, yeah, that was a while ago, like pretty much when we decided that we were going to do this episode. And he was like, oh, well, I'm sorry. Nobody's available to talk about Other Side of the Wind right now. We're about to start scanning the negatives and all this kind of stuff. And then got back to my computer, and he had sent me an email, and it was actually a response to the forward of Peter Jason's email. So I'm like, okay, no wonder I was confused, because I was actually requesting Peter Jason, not Peter Bogdanovich, but apparently everybody is kind of under lock and key, except for our friend Joseph McBride. So that's kind of nice that he was able to speak about the film. So they're in lockdown mode right now, they say, and they're going to be starting work on this, but it's one of those, I'll believe it when I see it. And I do have to say, I mentioned Josh Karp's book earlier. That is one of the most, I don't want to say mind-numbing, because that makes it sound like he didn't write it well. It is one of the most frustrating sections of his book about Other Side of the Wind, is just all of the attempts to bring the movie out that have just been thwarted over the years by various players that were involved or not involved. Andrew, you mentioned Beatrice Wells earlier, and she's one who's put the brakes on several times. Bogdanovich has put the brakes on a few times. So many things have stopped this movie from coming out, and I'm curious if it ever will.
I also heard that there may be an international component to this, because I read somewhere that it was funded by a producer who was an Iranian, and then the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, and that locked it away. Now, I don't know if that's true or if that's bullshit.
He was actually the cousin of the Ayatollah Khomeini.
See, I heard he was the brother of the Shah of Iran.
It was something like that. So it's been years for me. So, I'm sure you've got it better than I do.
I think the Shah makes more sense than the Ayatollah, but I just find it fascinating that now international intrigue is on top of this film. It's hard enough to get the damn film done and out, but no, then there has to be the Iranian Revolution on top. I just find that hilarious.
There's also France is involved, because it was Iran through France to the United States. So apparently the negative is held over in France. So, yeah, it's very much an international incident.
Apparently, even though the shoot went on forever and ever and ever, apparently it was a really fun shoot. And I thought that might be interesting to just kind of throw in there. Everybody that I've talked to talks about, the frustrations that they felt at the time. One thing I was going to point out that I just thought was hilarious, and I had to find a way to shoehorn this in there, was that Wells would stop shooting because MASH was on.
Hey, so would I, man.
So, it was very important he had his priorities.
Well, the other thing also remember during this time would have been towards the end of the shooting, because if this shot between 70 and 76 would have been Jodorowsky asking Orson Welles to be in his version of Dune. And remember, one of the stipulations that Jodorowsky talks about in the documentary of getting Welles for Dune was that he would hire this chef from the restaurant that he liked, and the chef would cater his meals on the set. And that was the stipulation to get him to play in Dune.
Welles was also offered Popeye before Robert Altman took the job, which, imagine, what a different Popeye that would be, especially with this crazy fast cross-cutting. But, just imagining Welles having sunk so low to do Popeye is a laugh. Obviously, Welles turned it down even though he was in need of money, to finance his own projects. He took on all those wine commercials and, we'll sell the wine before it's time and all that good stuff. But he had his standards. He was not going to do Popeye.
I don't know how many standards he had. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Malperitus, but I mean, he was in some bad movies at the time, and he was used to that, though. I mean, since the beginning, I mean, since he was in Jane Eyre, he was all about, like, I'll do the acting stuff in order to make the money to fund the directing stuff. And, he did that for so many years. And when you look at his filmography from 70 to 76, I mean, he was working, he was steadily working. I mean, there are little things like, Get to Know Your Rabbit. He was the narrator of Ricky Tikki Tavi. So, he was doing all this work in between. And, he had the wine commercials. He was doing, the frozen peas, of course, all these different commercial gigs in order to get the money to keep that project going. And that's kind of his whole raison d'etre was, I've got this great voice, I've got this great acting ability, I will do what it takes and use those gifts to try to fund what I really want to do, and what I really want to do is direct films.
Which, in a way, is the same model that, in a guy who completed a lot of film, a lot of great films, during the same era, John Cassavetes, where he would go do the acting gig and then use the money to make his own movies. So you have the same thing there. And I have to say, those wine ads, the wine ads by themselves are fine. I have a touch of like sadness and humor. I laugh, but I feel bad for laughing at the outtakes of the wine ads. And you know which one I'm talking about.
102, take 2.
The French champagne has always been celebrated for its excellence. There is a California champagne by Paul Masson, inspired by that same French excellence. It's fermented in the bottle, and like the best French champagne, it's vintage dated.
Cut.
So Paul Masson.
102, take 3.
Action, please.
The French. So
Cut.
Paul Masson.
And you just feel so bad. You're just like, oh man, how the mighty have fallen.
You know what's funny? Some of the ads were actually filmed by Graver and with Wells. I can't remember what the products were for, but he did so many products, and some of this was just weird stuff. And Sears had a really early version of the VCR, and they put out 6 movies. You could only get them from Sears, and they were all introduced by Orson Welles, shot by Graver. But I remember Graver saying that one time they drove out in the country because they were looking for silence, but they kept getting they kept getting cow moves in the background. And, all of this stuff is sort of comical to think of. You talk about how the mighty have fallen. It's just interesting to picture someone as grandiose and someone as accomplished as Wells out in the middle of a field trying to shoot a commercial with his buddy and getting cow noises in the background. I mean, yeah, and you're right. There was just about anything he would do. I think his standards only went so far, but I think that, they definitely applied to the directorial work. And the Popeye thing was a directorial gig, which, Altman took it, and God bless him for it, but I don't think it would have fit Wells.
I want to know, Andrew, how did you go from seeing Graver's contact information in a magazine to helping to write a book with him?
I wanted to do a book on Wells for years, but I wanted to do something from a different angle. And, so much of it has already been done. And, I haven't read Josh Karp's book yet, but I've got to say the greatest book that I've ever read on Wells is Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, which is by our buddy Joe McBride, who wrote the intro for our book. I just cold called him, and being Gary Graver, he was always working on something. He loved film. He shot outtakes for Steven Seagal movies and Fred Olen Ray stuff and just all kinds of, and he even did Al Adamson movies, Frankenstein versus Dracula or whatever that movie is, and he was always busy. So whenever I would call him, he'd be in the middle of a shoot, and he'd say, I have to call you back. And eventually, I got a hold of him, and we got to talk, and I told him that I really wanted to do a book on Wells, and I would be interested in telling his story. And apparently that's something that he had wanted to do for years. So I ended up going out to L.A. for a few weeks and got to spend a lot of time with him and his wife, Jillian. And we put together this book. And, it's something I'm really proud of. And Gary died in the middle of it before, the book was completed, which was sad. And then Jillian died a year later, which was also very sad. But, more than a good book, I got a friend out of the deal. And Gary Graver, he was a great, great guy. But you know what? He admired and respected and loved Orson Welles like no one.
Graver just one of so many people that Karp couldn't contact because there are just so many people that have passed away. I mean, even watching that little bit of footage, rewatching that this afternoon, it's like, oh wow, this person's gone. That person, of course, John Huston's gone, but even seeing like Mazursky, passed away kind of unexpectedly last year, and just so many other people where you're just like, oh man, when this movie comes out, there's just going to be a fraction of people left that were involved at all, and it's just it's pretty sad, and it's got to be challenging as an author trying to write a book about a movie that has yet to come out that was being filmed between 70 and 76, where now so many people have moved on. And at least there are works like what you did, Andrew, to help Gary, write his book and, have his memoir and everything, so that there are sources out there for people to, now go back and be able to piece larger stories together.
This is one of those things, we're never going to get the whole story, but it's great to have the bits and pieces, and I'm very excited about Josh Karp's book. I can't wait to read it, and I'm very excited, about the things that we're learning in this podcast. I think it's integral to learning the history of film and, the future and the past, to learn about someone such a luminary as well, such a visionary, and I think that this was a very important film, that we're probably never going to honestly see. But it's a book, and it was supposedly his book and the Citizen Kane. He wanted it to be his Citizen Kane at the end, and it may very well have been. And I think that learning about that is an important step towards learning about film.
So let's go ahead and take another break and play an interview with Josh Karp, the author of Orson Welles' last movie, The Making of Other Side of the Wind.
My name is Josh Karp. I'm a writer. My background is in journalism. For years, I did a lot of magazine journalism, profiles. I wrote for Chicago Magazine, the Chicago Sun-Times, mostly freelance stuff. Crane's Chicago Business I wrote for, and then did a lot of author profiles for magazines that no longer exist, that had names like Book and things like that. There aren't magazines about books so much anymore, but there are all these other one with a great, kind of book name. But anyway, yeah, so, I've been a freelance journalist for about 15 years, and I teach journalism occasionally at Northwestern University. And otherwise, I write nonfiction books. And this is my third nonfiction book, and the two prior ones were, I wrote a book about Doug Kenny, who started National Lampoon and wrote Animal House and Caddyshack, and then very mysteriously literally fell off a cliff in Hawaii to his death. And then I wrote a golf book, which is probably not as interesting given our circumstances. But basically what I do is write nonfiction books for a living.
What got you interested in The Other Side of the Wind?
Whenever I'm in the middle of working on a book, I think I might not be the only person who writes who feels this way. You get to this midway point and you're like, I don't want to finish this. This is horrible. I'm going to have to give all my money back to the publisher, and this is too much, and I'm never going to finish this, and this is horrible, and you want a huge distraction. For me, what happened was, for some reason, I was reading a book about Wells, or a book I had about Wells that was laying around, and I read just some great story from the other side of the wind. Some crazy story about John Huston on the set, or some crazy story about Wells, having an outburst or something like that. And I started to get really interested in that story, and I kind of got sidetracked because I'd known about it. And, I'm not a Wells scholar. I'm not, I love Orson Welles. I have seen his movies. He's somebody, who I grew up with, in kind of the Paul Masson era. But I knew all the other stuff too. But he was not, an obsession of mine. He was just, somebody I admired and somebody I understood who he was and what his place, in film history was. But the story, it started out with these great, crazy stories. And you could always find one or two or three of them somewhere, but you never got the whole story of the making of this picture. So at first I was kind of, just following these amusing stories. And the more and more I read about the film, and I read about the making of the film, I started to have this, feeling that, there was the fact that this film was unfinished, the fact that it, even though he denied its autobiographical nature, that there was something, really more meaningful about this just being a crazy making of a movie story. It seemed to me like this movie had, was symbolic in some way and meant something. And I wasn't sure what it was, though I had the suspicion that it was kind of like Stephen Colbert's portrait, of himself standing in front of the portrait of himself, standing in front of the portrait of himself. I thought that there was this very strange art imitating life imitating art, and just weird Hall of Mirrors aspect of it. So there were the great stories, there was this kind of greater depth, and, there was something that I wanted to learn about that, that I was just really intrigued by. And then the third thing was there are only so many great people, especially in the movie business, that haven't been written about to death. And Welles has been written about kind of to death, but I thought, wow, this is a chance to write about Orson Welles and John Huston, two guys who could not exist anymore. Two guys who were brilliant, lived these lives that people don't live anymore. And I thought, that this could be, a great opportunity. So I got back in and finished the other book, but I kept acquiring all this material on the other side of the wind over the course of finishing the other book. And by the time I was done with that, I sat down, and in the period in between finishing the book and the other book being published, I started to think, this is what I want to do next. And so that's what happened. And I feel like I got really lucky because it's a great story, and you could not get better characters. You could not make them up.
What's the timeline for this? Like, when are you first reading this story that sparks your interest, and when are you saying, okay, this is going to be my next project?
I think it was probably about 2010-ish that I started reading. It's actually kind of like shocking when I look back now, because, you always think when you go into something like this that you're just going to like knock it out in 18 months. Like, I've learned so much from what I've done before. This will be no problem. And, of course, so now I look back and it's 5 years ago. But, yeah, I think it was about 2010 that I kind of started getting the first inklings of wanting to, of being interested in wanting to do something about this. And then when my other book, my last book came out, I think it was like spring 2010 or summer 2010, I started going, okay, what am I going to do for my next book? And there were a couple different things, and this one was always the one that just came back. So I think I made the deal. I sold it to St. Martin's in sometime in mid-2011. So it was about a year and a half from being interested in it to finishing the other book and then writing a proposal for this book.
What was your approach when it came to researching the book?
The first thing I did was the internet obviously is fantastic, and you can find people so much more easily than even 10 years ago when I wrote my first book. But what I did was I initially just went and said, okay, how can I find these people? And what's so great is this movie was such, being around Orson Welles is something that nobody forgot. And anybody who was there for a day or a week or a year, this was one of the major moments in their life, even if they went on to achieve remarkable things. So as a result, everybody, who works in the entertainment industry, who's involved with this, who kept, who has a bio online, kept the other side of the wind in there. So I immediately was able to just access this huge number of people. So I'm writing down these huge lists of people. And the thing I did first, once I kind of amassed, a list of people, was I started with people who were not like, and it's not to demean them to say this, who are not the essential people. I started kind of from the outside. I wanted to interview people who were more tangentially involved, people who might have been an extra there for a week, people who might have been a crew member for 2 weeks. And I tried to work my way inwards to the most important people for a couple reasons. One, I knew that this was, this is a guy who people feel really, proprietary about, and whose work is very, very complicated, and it's not, it's a different kettle of fish to write about Orson Welles than it is to write about other people. So I wanted to learn in kind of smaller bits so that by the time I got, I kind of got bigger and bigger and more involved interview subject-wise as time went on. So what I did was, I interviewed, kind of from the outside in and got to where I'd interviewed 30 or 40 people, and I started to feel like, okay, I know what I'm talking about when I get to somebody who was there for a year, or who was on the set a lot. And the other thing it did, too, was that by the time you get to the people you really, really are like the big names that you're like, well, that's, those are the big fish I really want to interview, you have a little bit of leverage because you've got the information and you know the material as well as, hopefully anybody. And you can, when you can kind of live without them a little bit, when you aren't going to die without interviewing that person, then it's a lot easier to get them to talk to you. So that was kind of my strategy. Was I gathered written material, obviously, and read all that kind of stuff. But as far as interviewing people, I just moved inwards until at the end it was more Peter Bogdanovich and Frank Marshall and people like that who were more deeply involved.
When it comes to doing research, I always kind of liken it to, mining for gold. Where was some of those rich veins? Where did you strike the mother lode, especially when it comes to the written material? Because it seems like there's kind of a dearth of written material when it comes to this film.
I will admit to how many times I just stumbled upon things. You look back and you think, wow, I really did a great job researching this. And it's very easy at first to get, I could get everything every time it ever was mentioned in Variety, every time it was ever mentioned in the LA Times or Hollywood Reporter or any newspaper. So that was good, as far as, starting to kind of get a grip on just some of the real basics. But the real mother lode was when I found out, and I stumbled upon the fact that Wells's papers from this time were at University of Michigan. I can't remember how I stumbled on it, but I had been thinking almost everything was collected at Indiana. And because there is a bunch of stuff at the Lilly Library at University of Indiana. And when I found out about the Wells collection in Ann Arbor, I went up there and started reading it. All these blanks started getting filled in. And, one thing people may or may not know about Wells is the guy never slept. I mean, ever. If he wasn't shooting a film, if he wasn't doing voiceover for something, if he wasn't writing a script, if he wasn't rewriting the script for Other Side of the Wind, which he did compulsively and on, a very, an incredibly regular basis throughout the entire production, he was firing off memos to people. And this film, like most of his films, had a very complicated, all kinds of complicated financial stuff and, business dealings. There was just an overwhelming number of memos that he had written about this that were, ranged from providing great information. Some of them were hilarious, intentionally hilarious on his part. I mean, he writes a memo after he's written months of memos to his producer complaining about the editors and complaining about the toilets in the home that they're renting for him and complaining about this and that. And, things are very contentious. And then all of a sudden one day he says, one thing you can't complain about is the lack of diversity in, the subjects of the memos I write. I've written to you about toilets. I've written to you about editors. Today I'm writing to you about midgets. He then writes this great detailed description about how he basically wants to, what's the going rate to get midget actors in France, because he was in France at the time. And then he expresses, the difference between a midget and a dwarf, and that he prefers, and he says something, I wish I remembered exactly what he says. I prefer midgets. He said, of course, for filming. So one of the people whose name I found was a guy named Jack Epps, who I later learned was the screenwriter of Top Gun. And along with his name, and he's also a film professor at USC. When I contacted him, I said, I'll be in Los Angeles. I'd love to sit down and talk with you. And he said, sure, come to my house. And then I tried to get in contact with another person named Cynthia Steinway. And I actually asked Jack, I said, do you happen to know, these other people? And I gave him, 4 or 5 names who had worked on the set. And he said, well, I do know Cynthia Steinway. She's my wife. And Cynthia is not in the movie business like Jack is. And I had sat down with them, and Jack was great, and he had great recollections and said, gave me great quotes like, Wells was always incredibly respectful of the crew right up until the moment he fired all of us, and things like that. He was great with, good lines and good stories, and he understands movies. But Cynthia really didn't know who Wells was when she went to work on the film as his assistant. And she, has not pursued a career in the film industry. She does other things. So her perspective, and it often turns out to be this way, it was really fascinating. And like the most poignant story I think anybody told me was she discussed bringing him a very large order. I don't love to talk about all the Wells food stuff, but this is just happens to be the case. Very large order of fast food to his hotel room. And she came into the room, and I think he might have been already eating something else. And he was wearing a bathrobe, and there was a food stain on it, and there were bottles of medicine all over every possible surface because he was not in great health. And she walked in with all this food and saw him eating and saw all this medication and kind of just, I think, stood there like and took it in for a moment. And he saw her doing this and was embarrassed. And he just looked at her and he goes, "Do you think I want to live this way?" And, to me, that was really important to me to get stories like that, because you're talking about, you can't get more larger than life as a pop culture figure, as a person in the movie industry than Orson Welles. And he is known, in culture for one of two things. He's the Citizen Kane guy, right? He's the genius, or he's the guy who did all the Paul Masson commercials and was overweight. And he played the part of Orson Welles all the time, and he loved it. And I know he enjoyed being that big figure, but underneath all that, there's a lot in between Paul Masson Orson and Citizen Kane Orson. And underneath all that, there's a real guy, because there's always a real person there. And so that to me was one of the most, that was what, talk about, the moments of, getting the gold. That was really like a moment of getting some real gold.
Who were some of the most surprising people that you found that had worked on this film?
There were all these people who were alleged to have been in the movie who were not, and who I got to kind of follow up with. So like I contacted Lily Tomlin's representative, because at some point Lily Tomlin was allegedly asked to be in the movie. She had no recollection of it. There are all kinds of other people. Jack Nicholson was supposed to have been in the movie. And there were people, it was great because you do interviews. This is 40 years ago. And people remember this as this bigger than life experience. They're like, "Oh my God, and that was the night we shot with Nicholson." And Nicholson was never there. So there's all kinds of, kind of great apocryphal stuff that happened. But one of, or a lot of legend, I guess. But one of the really fun things was, one time after Wells died, Showtime for many years was deeply involved in trying to get the film completed. And I believe the story was that some Showtime executive was having a meeting with Les Moonves, who runs CBS, which owns Showtime. And they said, one of the things we got to talk about is this crazy Orson Welles movie that he never finished. I'm sure you've never heard of it. It's called The Other Side of the Wind. And Les Moonves said, "Heard of it? I'm in it." This was a story told to me by Joe McBride and a couple other people. And I thought, well, there's no way Les Moonves is going to talk to me, but what the hell, I'll give it a shot, because here's this guy who's like one of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry, and he was there. So I contacted CBS Publicity, and that's publicity people, unless there's a real good reason for them to want to help you, don't always help you. And they, their reaction, I explained the situation, and they were kind of like, you'll hear back from us, never. And a couple days later, I get an email back, and they're like, Les Moonves would love to talk to you. And, he really didn't, it was great because he wanted to know about what happened, which was just so fun, and there were people, the whole thing was so disjointed that nobody, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, people were there for periods of time. And there were people who were there for a long period of time but didn't know about all kinds of things that happened. And somebody who knew about the financing didn't know anything about the shooting of the film. And people who knew about the shooting of the film never got to, talk to several of the actors. So it was kind of cool because once you start learning all the details and you become the person who's got some authoritative knowledge of it, it makes great conversation because people love the experience. They never forgot it. And you could share information with them that helped you because it would feed their ability to talk back to you. But just, really, the interviews were great because, my most memorable interview, I guess, just in terms of sheer entertainment, was Rich Little, who was in the movie playing the part of a guy who was a successful young director, very much like Peter Bogdanovich, who was playing and he was the character, his name was Brooks Otterlake, was a protege of the main character played by John Huston, who's a famous director. And so I get Rich Little on the phone, and, you kind of forget what a really great impressionist can do. And so, I don't think a lot about people who do celebrity impressions, but here I am on the phone with Rich Little, and he is doing conversations between John Huston and Orson Welles as John Huston and Orson Welles. One of the great regrets of my life is that I'm really good at typing and was not able. I don't tape all my interviews. I type during them. And so I don't have any tape of that. But that was just, it was unreal. I mean, and he was, he's so good at doing those guys. And just, boom, 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 full conversations back and forth between the two guys. So that was great. That was probably among the most memorable interviews.
It seems so strange that he was the original Otterlake, whereas the character just seems so Bogdanovich, and Bogdanovich is famous also for doing impressions, not as much as Rich Little, but it's like, why weren't you there originally?
The story with Bogdanovich that's fascinating, and this was what, going back to kind of what attracted me to the story, Bogdanovich's role is the perfect example of that. So, Bogdanovich and Welles had this kind of, mentor-protege relationship. And when Bogdanovich was a film writer, or wrote about film, and he was a critic, wrote for Esquire, and was writing about film. And he was writing, doing work for Roger Corman and learning how to make movies. And he made Targets, but he was not the Peter Bogdanovich yet. So in 1970, when they first started shooting the film, Bogdanovich and Joe McBride, on day one, August 23rd, 1970, at this rented house in Beverly Hills, they are playing two characters who are both guys who are writing books about the main character, about this great director. At the time, McBride and Bogdanovich are both film writers writing books about Orson Welles. Fast forward 4 years later, Bogdanovich has made Last Picture Show, he's made What's Up, Doc, and he's made Paper Moon. And Rich Little is hired to play this character who's very much like Bogdanovich. He's got 3 hit movies. He even has his own production company, and the valuation of it, I think they refer to it at some point as $40 million, which is roughly what the director's company that Bogdanovich was involved with was worth at the time. So he is like totally Bogdanovich. And Rich Little either gets fired or leaves the set, or there's a misunderstanding and has to leave. So Rich Little disappears, and Welles is in deep trouble because he shot all this film with Rich Little, and now he's gone. And he's got John Huston there, and he's got all these people in Arizona where they're shooting, and he needs somebody to play this part. And he calls up Bogdanovich, who he speaks to every day. And he says, Peter, I'm in huge trouble. Rich Little is left. He says, what am I going to do? And Bogdanovich says, well, why don't I play the part? And Welles says, well, of course you can't play the part. He says, you're playing the other role. And he says, well, that's a tiny role. If we can reshoot that with somebody else, it won't be a problem. He says, I'll do this. And Welles goes, oh my God, I never thought of that. You're perfect for this. And Bogdanovich says, so he's a protege of the lead character. He's got 3 hit movies in a row, and he loves to do celebrity impressions all the time. And you never thought of me for the part? And with Welles, it's kind of great because you never know. Welles is directing every moment of his life. So you don't know, what Welles, if Welles had always, thought, well, I'll just get Bogdanovich, or if he genuinely was kind of flabbergasted by this sudden thought. But all of a sudden, Bogdanovich goes from playing in 1970, he's playing who he is in 1970, and now in 1974, he's playing who he is in 1974. And, in fact, that was one of the things that I loved, that was pretty universal among people I interviewed, was the surreal quality of the film set, and where does the movie end and where does real life begin, or where does real life end and where does the movie begin. And in fact, one script supervisor said that it was just incredibly confusing at a certain point because you didn't know what was what. And several people, including people who are close to Bogdanovich, said they were like, when Bogdanovich showed up, it was like, okay, this is officially just the weirdest thing ever. This is so surreal that if you told somebody this happened, that's the old line, they would never believe you. If you put this in a movie, they'd say it was ridiculous and way too far-fetched. But that's the kind of thing that happened. And interestingly enough, with Bogdanovich, his character and the Huston character play out a lot of stuff that was in the Wells-Bogdanovich relationship. I mean, it's not an exact match, but it's similar. And the Huston character is looking for money, and Wells is looking for money. And the Bogdanovich character has a lot of money, and Bogdanovich at the time has a lot of money. There's this whole, kind of almost like weird passive-aggressive artistic playing out of the relationship. After all this ends, there's a falling out between the characters. They shoot it. And like about a year and a half later, Wells and Bogdanovich have a falling out that is now life imitating the art. So, and that to me was just fascinating, because I think, to me, one of the real essences of the story is, here is a guy who is such a great artist, and he gets to a point where his life and his art just merge. And to me, that was one of the most interesting things to learn about.
Was anyone reticent to talk to you about the film?
There were people who took some time. Some people who nobody would ever have heard of, but who were intimately involved, who were not eager to talk, and who, after a fashion, did talk to me. The one person who did not talk to me was Oya Kodar, who was Orson's mistress and who played the female lead in the film, and who, was something of an artistic collaborator of Orson's throughout the last 20 years of his life. Oya and I tried to get in touch with Oya for 2 years. I sent her FedEx packages. I sent her telegrams. She lives in Croatia. I called her. I did everything I could that would get a receipt that said that it had actually been delivered, so that I knew that at least she was receiving these things. And then one day, about 2 years in, I called her and we had a conversation, and she was very enthusiastic about the book and about the idea. But then we just couldn't. She really wanted to know everything that was going to be in the book before she would allow me to come over and talk to her. And and I think probably rightfully so. I mean, she's very was very possessive of Wells, and he was the great love of her life. And I think she one of the things was she also wanted to be able to really approve what was going in the book. And legally I couldn't do that, and I couldn't work that way, just in terms of timing or in terms of being able to write the kind of book I needed to write. So I kind of said, I totally respect your position, and if you change your mind, I'd love to talk to you. And that was it. So she did not speak to me, but she was really the only major person who was alive that I tried to get that would not talk to me.
One of the things that I've found with Wells in looking at written material about him and just stories about him and everything is it feels very, well, and I'm sure you've experienced it, it feels very Rauschman. It's what do you believe? Whose perspective are you getting? What were some of the biggest conflicts that you got? I mean, you mentioned the people that were allegedly there, but what were some of the bigger ones where it was like so many people said one thing and so many people said another?
There are a couple things. One of them was the departure of Rich Little, because everybody remembered it vividly and everybody remembered it differently. And there were, people who said, oh, Wells realized that Little wasn't a good actor, but he didn't want to fire him because he liked him personally. So he kind of created a situation where he was able to let him go without it seeming like a bad thing. Little claimed that he had told Wells ahead of time, and this is not, I'm not saying it's right, but it's not hard to believe that he had told him ahead of time, hey, I've got, a bunch of stand-up gigs booked. that I have to do. So I can only work during, this 3.5 to 4 week period of time. And Wells said, no problem. And then it just came to the point where Little had to leave. He left and it was devastating to Wells. There are other people who think, who said Wells was furious and, couldn't take it and fired Rich Little. And then there are other people who said that Rich Little was there one day and then would just disappear in the middle of the night. So, in those circumstances, one of the things you also always have to remember is, these are real people and they're alive, Rich Little. And, you can't say, oh, he did this, he did that. You have to kind of give, with Wells, every side of the story sometimes. So I kind of told that, I think, 3 different ways. There's also the story of money being stolen, allegedly being stolen from the production while they were in Arizona. And there were so many sides of that story that it was just, my initial draft of writing about it was about 20 pages long. Just trying to, give everybody's side of the story because, you don't know what really happened in some cases.
It's, again, life imitating art. I mean, this is so Charles Foster Kane with all the different people telling their Charles Foster Kane stories.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing, obviously, that Wells, loved to say was, that he kind of dismissed the people who were doing all the critical analyses of what everything meant. And, he made the great comment to Mike Nichols about, talking about the themes of your work that, screw it, just wait until you're dead and let the guys who do that for a living figure out what it all meant. Which I think is great, but he was such a complicated guy. And I think, there was also a side of him that loved the analysis of what he did. And, and enjoyed the fact that people were really interested in this. And as somebody who is not, again, a Wells scholar, to me, there's such incredible symmetry to the way his career starts with Kane. And, the fact that there's incredible irony in the fact that the opening of Kane is, you see Xanadu, which is Kane's unfinished mansion, which is named for, and they recite, a poem by Coleridge that is unfinished, right? And there's all this incompletion at the start of his first movie. The subtle theme of things not being finished is all over the first few sequences of Kane. And here you come, which then, of course, becomes, to me, the most complete movie ever made, right? I mean, it's again, I'm not a film scholar, but it's perfect to me. It's just so satisfying. You don't finish that movie and go I just wish they'd, there was that moment where, you just watch it and you're like, wow, that just, whatever it was, it worked on every level. And it's so tight and, and just complete and kind of this perfect thing. And then you have this thing at the end of his life that is, famously incomplete. And I think there's this real symmetry to, I think there's a lot of Wells in Kane, and I think there's a lot of Wells in Jake Hannaford, the protagonist of Other Side of the Wind. And I think that's I spent a lot of time writing about it, and I don't know that I can express it verbally, but I think Kane they are both Wells to some extent. And I think Wells was really, and Kane is kind of young Kane is who Wells starts out as. There's so many, there are similarities in their upbringing. There are similarities between them, as, men of great appetite with great desire to do great things. And they're great men. And in the end, you have Jake Hannaford, who is also kind of a great man in the sense of, in a Hollywood sense. And he is diminished and at loose ends. And I don't know that that's necessarily an expression of exactly where Wells was, but Wells was in a very different place, and he was at a very difficult place at this time of his life. So it's almost just eerie how much it's like the progression of Kane's life in some strange way. It's not, moment for moment, and, he doesn't, drop the thing and say Rosebud and all that. But there's he's remarkable because he's so big that he can't help but be part of every movie he makes, if that makes sense. It's in a way his story even when it's Shakespeare. It touches on all the Wellesian themes. And it's kind of about him. And that's not a negative thing. I mean, he's a remarkable guy, and his life is, he lived a Cain-like existence.
I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about the film is that this wasn't Orson Welles' final film. This didn't end with him dying. So what was the story as far as how the film wraps up versus how Orson wraps up? Because there is that period in between there, and why wasn't there more motion in that last bit?
One of the other great weird coincidences is the protagonist of the film, Hannaford. The film opens with his death in a car accident. And the question is it a suicide or is it an accident? And, you know, that's also how Cain opens, right, is with the death of the main character. And Hannaford dies at the age of 70. And Welles, 15 years after he starts shooting the film, dies at the age of 70. There were a lot of reasons the film didn't get finished. But, you know, one of probably the biggest reasons is that it is Welles' relationship to money and his relationship to the financing of a film. He had an absolutely, you know, for a guy who was such a smart guy, easily the smartest person I'll ever write about in my life. Yeah, and he knew, it's fascinating, he knew that he had this horrible blind spot when it came to picking the right people to work with as producers, when it came to, you know, getting a film financed. He said, you know, he'd had people steal money from him in the past, and he said to somebody at some point, he said, you know, I get it. I'm like the guy who every time he walks out at the front door, he gets struck by lightning. And at a certain point, you know, it's not the lightning, it's the guy. You know, it's a paraphrase, but I mean, I think, you know, he knew he was, you know, he had this knack for being really snake bit. And so the film was financed in large part by the Chavarant's brother-in-law, who was actually a really good guy, as far as I could tell, and really willing to give Welles a lot of rope and to allow him, you know, to give him his time to make this film. And I think, you know, Welles got very caught up, you know, he filmed it on and off between 70 and 76. And, you know, things happen, like Rich Little left, and all of a sudden he has to junk a huge amount of stuff that he's shot. So he has to kind of start over. He gets in his own way several times. He develops a somewhat adversarial relationship with his financiers, which isn't necessarily reflective of their character. It's just kind of a friction almost that he needed to work. You know, he kind of had to have trouble with the money guys sometimes to work. It was just a part of how things went with him. So what happened was everything was supposed to kind of come together when he received the AFI Life Achievement Award in 1975. And the film was largely complete. He needed some end money. He went and made this speech at the AFI award dinner, and it was a great speech. It's like a brilliant speech. And it's kind of geared to redeem himself and explain himself to Hollywood, but also to get money to finish the film. And I always think, you know, this is not the whole story, but the irony is that he shows a couple clips from The Other Side of the Wind at this event. And then the last clip he shows, after he kind of takes a little bit of a dig at the money people in his speech, but he's getting away with it because it's such a good speech and he's so charming. And he's Orson Welles, and he can just grab this whole room, you know, of famous people and rich people and just, you know, own the whole thing. And he shows a clip that is a scene of his producer, or of Hannaford's producer in the movie, showing Hannaford's unfinished picture to a studio head who they're trying to get end money from. Again, you have the surreal life imitating art, art imitating life. So he's showing the scene of the guy kind of begging for end money, while he is subtly begging for end money. And the scene, which is about a fictional character, kind of confirms all the things, all the legends about Welles that he couldn't finish things. Like it shows how incomplete Hannaford's movie is. And there's just this weird irony to that moment. To me, that's kind of the moment when symbolically everything fell apart. They had meetings with people. They thought all kinds of people were going to make offers. And again, you get the, Rashomon experience. Some people say, oh, there was a great offer, and the producers rejected it. And then another one never came. But Bogdanovich said, he gave one of the best quotes. He said, the real irony was everybody stood and applauded as loudly as they'd ever applauded in their lives, but nobody gave him a cent. So after that, in 1975, things just kind of devolved. He had some opportunities to get the film financed. His producer, the Shah's brother-in-law, saw things were going bad in Iran and was saying, hey, I'm going to try to sell my ownership to somebody who will help you get this movie finished. And Welles, as best I can tell, really, the closer he could get to getting a really good deal, there was this way in which he kind of started to recede from things, because I think he wanted total control. And if there was an ounce of control he couldn't get, he got it would make him a little bit stuck. And I think he'd been burned so many times by lack of control that, he just couldn't, as best I can tell, pull the trigger on making at least at least one deal that could have saved this picture for him. And then, when push came to shove, he wound up in a dispute with the Iranians. The Iranian Revolution happened. The film got locked up in a lab where it was being edited. Welles had taken the work print, so he had a print of the film, but he didn't have the negative. There was a legal battle. The legal battle is so complicated, it almost defies explanation, but his daughter, Beatrice, under a French law, which I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of, which is droit d'auteur, which is basically the right of the author, all creative ownership of a project reverts to the author. Okay? So after Welles died, she really had kind of creative ownership over it. Yet Oya Kodar owned Wells's financial stake in it, and also, had a claim to it as a co-writer and as a star of the film. And then the Boucherie family, which was the Shah's brother-in-law, they had a claim. And then the production company that he set up also had a claim. So there are all these parties. And after Welles died, every time you could get three people to agree on something, the fourth would tank it. And it didn't matter who it was. It was like everybody took turns making this not happen. And in a way, Gary Graver, who was Welles' cinematographer shortly before he died in 2006, had said to Joe McBride, Gary spent his whole adult life almost working on this picture past the age of 30 and was going around the world trying to get people to finance the completion of the film. And he said to McBride, when they saw each other, he said, I'm still working for Orson. I never stopped. And, this is, 21 years after Welles died. And I think there's some kind of great, again, symmetry and irony in the fact that here we are now, 45 years after Welles started this movie, 30 years, since his death, people are still trying to get the film finished. People are still working for Orson Welles 30 years after he died. And I think, that one of the great quotes I got was from somebody was they said, Welles, more than anything, he just loved getting up to make movies in the morning. That was, to him, that was great. Was just if he got up in the morning and he knew he was going to make a movie, he was happy. And the guy also said, you have all these people trying to enact your vision. And that is one of the most intoxicating experiences you can ever imagine. And I kind of love the idea of Welles kind of from beyond the grave, still has all these people working for him and trying to untangle this incredibly Byzantine, Wellesian, legal, financial, interpersonal knot that was created both in the dispute over the film while he was alive and then after he died, because, of course, his estate was not a simple deal either. One thing I learned is nothing was ever real simple for Welles. So he created a very complicated afterlife for the film.
Yeah, I got to say that chapter that you put in there where you're talking about the legal battles and all the things that happened after his death, I can't imagine the patience that you had to write that, because my eyes, and this is not an insult to you, but my eyes were glazing over just with, oh my God, what can happen next? How can this go wrong again? And my jaw was on the floor.
I did some interview where somebody said, they said, well, how many people have tried to complete the film over the years? And I said, I can't answer that question because the one thing I know is, and this is when the article came out in the New York Times in October last year that said, hey, they're really close to getting a deal done to finish this film. I said, the second that article runs, I said, I'm going to get emails from 20 people who said, between 2005 and 2006, I was involved in trying to get that film completed. We bought the rights to this from so-and-so. And, or between 1992 and 94, I worked really hard on this. And that was really, I knew that no matter what I put in there, that the world was crawling with people who at some point for a period of time who I don't know about. And in fact, I got an email from the guys who wrote Ed Wood. And they, at one point, had been involved in trying to help Gary Graver get the whole thing done. And it was just totally wild. I got an email from the guy like the next day, and they were not the only people. So it was, as you say, your eyes glazed over. It was mind numbing. I mean, it was exhausting to write that part of the book.
That seems like that would have been the hardest part to write. I mean, more than a movie that nobody's seen with a cast that is half dead. Who knows how many folks from them. I mean, most of your key players or a lot of your key players are gone. Right. It seems like that legal stuff would have been tougher than to write about this movie that nobody has seen.
It was funny because I really, when I was writing about that, I thought to myself, I just want to capture the essence of how crazy this is. And I'm not going to do anything more than I have to because that it's so, it's too much. And in fact, Philip Rimsa, who's, one of the producers finishing the film, who's every time I think about what he's gone through and how long he's hung with this to try to get it done. And I know, they get close and then something happens and I know they're really close, but I think about what he's been through and just having written about it was hard. To be the person who says, I'm doing that, I don't know how my head is completely off to him and the other people involved because it's a staggering undertaking. One of the guys I interviewed was this guy, Fred Zalo, who had produced Mississippi Burning. And he, at the time, had the money and the power and all that in Hollywood. And he heard about it and he was like, you know what? I'm going to get this done. And he thought, this is Hollywood. All I got to do is just offer enough money to everybody. And he was told what everybody's price was. Everybody wanted X million dollars. So he offered them a little bit more than that because that was what everybody would accept. And he offered them more knowing that there might be, trouble. And everybody came back and wanted twice what he offered. And then he, said, okay. And he offered them more than that. And then they wanted twice that. And he said, even for Hollywood, this is completely insane. I back away. Even by the standards of this industry, this is just completely crazy. And there were so many near misses and just so, and, they're all just people, they're all people. And it's a very emotional thing, but it's like it's set up to always wind up this way. It's almost frustrating to write about it because you just go oh, like you said, it's like, when is this car accident going to happen again?
Over the years, footage has kind of snuck out. The shooting style, the editing style is just so crazy for this film, but it's acceptable now, but I can't imagine watching this footage 40 years ago. I mean, this probably would have blown some people's minds. I mean, this is just intense. And I have you seen more footage than what's kind of floating out there? Because there's about maybe an hour that is in the ether.
I've seen the assembled hour. I haven't seen. There's this kind of mythical 2.5 hour rough cut that nobody can find and nobody knows really exists. But I've seen. The kind of 50 minutes to an hour that's edited by Wells and by Gary Graver in different parts and also has, just some raw footage of various scenes. somewhere along the way, somebody was talking about the editing. And I was not and I'm still not, but I was not an expert on editing when I entered this project. And I learned a lot about editing from and he worked with 20 million editors on this film. I mean, there are so many guys who worked on this film editing it. And Wells edited it compulsively. He would go back to a scene a year later that he had spent months editing 4 minutes and go back and say, I think I can make that better. But somebody said to me somewhere around the middle of the process, they said, remember, this is, I can't remember how many years, but they're like, 20 years before Natural Born Killers. And all of a sudden I was like, wow, okay. And this is 15 years before MTV. And that's, so the editing is, in my, limited knowledge of editing, is just incredibly ahead of its time. And it is, when I first watched it, it took time to get used to the rhythm of it. And at first I thought, oh my God, I'm writing a book about this. I'm not gonna be able to watch it. I'm like, I'm gonna hate it. Like, I'm not gonna understand it. It's just gonna be this big, crazy, jumbled mess. But after about 4 or 5 minutes, and it's kind of brilliant that way, you settle into it, and it becomes a really, kind of, you fall into the rhythm of the film. And the storytelling works in that way because you kind of, at first you think, I can't do this. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm totally with it. I've got it. I'm following this. And all of that really jarring stuff becomes an interesting way to tell a story. The other thing, of course, is, it's 2 movies. It's the movie, which is the documentary style movie, which is the story of Jake Hannaford and his birthday party and this last day of his life and the making of this film. And then there's the film Hannaford is making, which is a total contrast. So you have this really jarring cinema verite, documentary style, quick cut stuff. And then you have this kind of mock Antonioni 35 millimeter big screen nonsensical film that Hannaford is making. So you have so it's weird. Like, and it's, somebody said to me, and I always thought this was great. They said, he was making 2 different films and neither of them was in his own style. And that to me was fascinating because I think that really meant something. I think, he was able to do things and mask certain things by playing other characters. Like, he filmed, obviously, one of the big things people say is he filmed, sexual content and eroticism for the first time in his life because he could do it by pretending he was Hannaford trying to make a movie like Antonioni. And that's so like Orson Welles, right? Just like all the hidden stuff. And then obviously the cinema verite stuff it's not Citizen Kane. So yeah, it's really fascinating. And it was a really, I found it also really fascinating that he, at this time of his life, he was always challenging himself. And I found that to be such a redeeming quality of his. He didn't want to do anything twice, ever. One of the things people frequently said that I found fascinating was they said, he would invent a problem, not just to create chaos, but he would invent a huge problem so that he could create his way out of it. And in that way, come up with a great solution. So he would invent an impossible situation and then have to figure it out, and he might sit for 2 days making everybody watch him stew, while they're in the middle of the Arizona desert until he came up with a solution. But, that was, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to think of a guy being that creative and to have that being part of his process.
So what do you think? After having read and researched and written about all this stuff, what do you think the chances are that it's actually going to happen?
The people who are involved right now, if anybody can pull it off, I think it's these guys. One of the quotes I got about the early production was from Mike Stringer, who did just a little bit of everything on the film. And he said, if you came there for the right reasons, you got along just fine, and Orson loved you. But if you were there for the wrong reason, he'd eat you alive. If you were there to meet Orson Welles, like, you were gone. If you were there, for anything other than being there to help Orson Welles make a movie because it was important to help Orson Welles make a movie. And I'm not saying that as Orson being egotistical. I mean, that was just the ethos of it. I mean, that's why people were there. They didn't care if they didn't get paid. They didn't care if they worked 20-hour days. They didn't care if they never saw their families. To them, it was like, this is just an important goddamn thing to do. That's the only approach that can work to getting the film completed. You certainly can't be doing it for the money, because I don't think anybody's going to get rich off of it. And you can't be doing it for your ego, because I think that also is a huge disaster waiting to happen. And I think, there's this kind of way in which, unless you're doing it for the right reasons, it's not going to work. So that said, I think these guys are the right, Frank Marshall, Philip Rimsa, Jens Kostner-Kahl, they're there for the right reason. They think it's important to get Orson Welles, even though it's not his last movie. I mean, it essentially is his last attempt to make, the big comeback. They're there because it's important to get this movie made, and it's not about their ego, and it's not about making money. That said, I have no idea if this is going to come through. And that's no comment on them. I hear really positive things that this is going to happen, but as Joe McBride will tell you, he's always, said, that he always envisioned himself going to the premiere, with a walker. And, and that every day, that reality, becomes more and more looming. The thing one thing I heard consistently from people who worked on the film was they said, when I asked them about whether it would ever be finished, they'd say, I will believe this film is going to be finished when I am sitting in a theater and I've seen the last end credit run. Again, I think these guys are real competent, and I think they're doing it for the right reasons. And if anybody can do it, they can. But, far be it from me to go against the people who say, hey, I'm not going to believe it. The people who are there and they say, when I'm sitting in the theater and I see that last credit, it's going to be done. That said, I hope they succeed. They're great guys. And I as we discussed, it was exhausting just writing about it. What they go through trying to get this done, I think is extraordinary. And they're doing it for film history too. And I think that's important.
Are you all geared up for a second edition if the film comes out?
Second edition of the book? No. I mean, yes, of course. But I mean, I when I finished writing the book, it ended at a certain point. And I had written the story of the making of the movie. I had written the story of what happened to it afterwards. And it's interesting because, I talked through with my editor, I said, God, what happens if this movie gets made? What happens? What are we going to do? What happens if this all works out 2 weeks before publication? And we kind of agreed, hey, we'll run whatever headline there is in Variety, and make that the last page of the book, that says, hey, Orson Welles movie premiering at Cannes. Because it's really, I mean, how you said, you said it was exhausting to read about what happened. I told the story that I had to tell about it. And what happens now is just, it's great if I just want the movie to be finished, but I can't, as a writer and a journalist, I can't stick with the story from that perspective for the rest of my life, because I'll be sticking with it for the rest of my life. I mean, it's funny, there were really moments where I was writing the book, and this is going to sound so asinine, so just take it for what it's worth. There are moments where I was like, okay, this is going to be just like the movie. This is never going to be finished. Because every time you thought you were done, or you thought you had something, you found something, it's so typical of Orson Welles, you found something contradictory, or you found something new. There was a real, and I think it helped in writing it in some ways, but it wasn't pleasant. There were times where there was a real pervasive sense of like, I'm just going in a circle, and this is going to go on forever. And this is going to be, I'm never going to finish this, and this is what is going to occupy the rest of my life while my family starves, because I never finished the book and never got to move on to anything else. I kind of feel like I've exhausted my ability to tell the story. I think that's what I would say about a second edition. I would certainly write an addendum, but the thought of writing new material about it, I'm so happy with the story, not necessarily, I'm not saying this about the book, I'm just saying with the story. I feel like I got the story I wanted to get. And everything that's happening after this is kind of after the story I wrote. I don't know if that makes any sense. I completed my thing, and I got out with my life.
And we're back. Thanks to Josh Karp for coming on the show. And we have a link over where you can check out his book over at our website, projection-booth.com. The book is about a movie that hasn't come out yet, and this is a podcast about a movie that we haven't seen and hasn't come out yet. But, gentlemen, what do you think it'll mean if The Other Side of the Wind will come out? Say it opened magically, September, Toronto Film Festival, a limited run, art house. What do you think? What then? Do you think that people will be happy with it? Or do you think that maybe, as I talked about before, something like Touch of Evil, where Touch of Evil was put out, obviously, after Orson Welles' death in that reconstituted version based on his memo. And I heard some people go, yeah, I don't know if this actually was his vision.
I don't think there's any way it can live up to the hype. I think that, in a way, it's a more important work unseen. And I think it's more important to his legacy that it remains unseen. Because it's a masterpiece that's unattainable. It's become this lore that there's no way, it's just not possible for this film to be everything that everybody wants it to be. And that it may be a wonderful film, and the scenes I've seen have been great. But, and then I have to worry, I think we have to consider that with someone else cutting it, it's not really going to be what Welles wanted, as you said. I don't think that it could ever live up to the hype, and I don't think it could ever truly be the film that Welles would have made himself.
That is definitely one of the dangers I see, as far as so much of the film was in Welles's head. That blueprint died with him. And I don't necessarily think that, it's all fine and good to have a 60-page memo that he wrote to about Touch of Evil. But at least with that, you had Touch of Evil as a standalone piece, and then the memo, and then the ability to go back in and try to see how the memo relates to Touch of Evil, and then, Merch and everybody doing just an amazing job of recutting to those specifications as best that they possibly can. I can't even imagine what kind of book you would have to have, what kind of Bible size, Torah and Talmud, Old and New Testament, everything, in order to get the instructions for how to cut together Other Side of the Wind. I mean, even seeing the little bits and pieces that we've seen, seeing the 45 minutes, 50, whatever you want to say, amount of screen time, those pieces don't fit together that well. So what is there that connects those? Are there connectors? And how are they going to know what to do with this thing? I mean, will they take it another step and maybe put another frame around the frame? You've got the film within the film already, and then, you could almost do the film around that, and the struggle to put together Other Side of the Wind, and it's yet another lost film, kind of, piecing together the lost film within the lost film. I mean, it's just it's like Russian dolls here. So
you know what that would look like to me? It would be like, and obviously both of these movies are out, and the first film was out. It would be like if you took Hearts of Darkness and then edited it into Apocalypse Now, like the really long version, like the 5-hour can edit, right. So it's like, here's the documentary and the film, everything together all in one place. And that just, to me, on one end sounds like a total film nerdgasm, and at the other end sounds horrific, depending on the day.
Yeah, if you're putting together this film, you better have a fucking camera crew there to capture everything that goes on with the putting together of the film, the interviews, the talking heads, all this kind of stuff. You need to basically make the movie of Karp's book plus whatever has happened since Karp's book has come out, I mean, since he sent it to the publisher kind of thing, because he sent it to the publisher before the big article in the New York Times last year, which kind of set off another firestorm. And who knows, there have been posters cited that that stuff's going to happen. I mean, it's kind of funny. This podcast is dropping on May 6th, the 100th birthday of Orson Welles. And if you go out, at least at the moment when we're recording this, you go out to IMDb right now, it says release date for Other Side of the Wind, May 6th. And I'm like, yeah, not going to happen. Definitely not going to happen. Not when they're calling me last week telling me they're starting to scan the negative, but will it ever happen? And would that be a good thing? Would you? My fear is kind of what you described, Rob, where it opens at some festivals. Very few people get to see it at these festivals. It opens in an art house run, and we film nerds around the globe go to see this, the ones who are in the know, the ones who are down with Welles, because not everybody is. I mean, it's kind of that select group, unfortunately, and I'm not trying to be elitist or anything. It's just kind of like too many people think of him as the before our time kind of guy, or the guy who shows up at the end of the original Muppet movie, or they just don't know who this guy is. Anybody who's under, a certain age wouldn't know who Welles possibly is. So then what? It plays art houses for 2 weeks, and then what? 6 months later, you get a Blu-ray release. Maybe it plays VOD. And then is that it? Does it go on the shelf and nobody talks about Other Side of the Wind? It's not going to set the world on fire like Citizen Kane. It's not going to set the world on fire like all the discussions that we've had about this film that doesn't exist. So I almost think maybe it shouldn't come out.
I do feel that way. And I feel like there's no way that, even if it's done properly, and which it very well may be, there's no way that it can have the impact that it would have had in the 1970s. I mean, all of these things were ahead of their time. It's just like Citizen Kane today. If you tell somebody this is quote-unquote the greatest film ever made, and they don't know much about film, they're not going to be bowled over because they've seen all of these techniques. And a lot of that is going to be the same thing. They originated with Welles, or, Welles honed them in his own way, but they've been done to death now, and they've been done by other people. And I'm just afraid that the newness and the freshness of the whole thing is gone.
Well, the other aspect of it, too, being like we were talking about as a satire in a way of those directors who went on to do those youth films of the late 60s, early 70s, unless you're film geeks like us and you know what New Hollywood was and why it was important and all of that stuff, that's probably just going to go over your head. You're not even going to understand what they're even referencing. I mean, there's part of me that just wants to see it just to see it. It's like we've waited so long. It's been 40 years. Let's just see it. Even if it's not as tight as it should be or exactly how Wells's perfect vision of it is, because obviously he didn't have his hands on the editing at the end. There's just part of me that wants to see it like an unfinished painting. Like one of the more famous unfinished paintings that we have in America is that one of George Washington, where you have the head of him, but the bottom of it's not finished. But they still put it up, and people take a look at it, and you go, wow, that guy was a really good painter. He did a really nice portrait of George Washington. That's kind of how I feel about it. Is it may be rough around the edges, but I still want to see it. I still want to experience it in some manner, even if it's not going to be pristine and perfect to what exactly the artist wanted you to see.
Yeah, no doubt. I want to see it. I do want to see it. I'm not, I don't misunderstand me. I'd love to see it, after all these years. So many people's hopes and dreams have been pinned to this movie. But, I do worry that it's not going to be the pure version. But you're right. As a film geek, I would give anything to see even some crazy truncated version of this.
Even some of the people that are in the cast of the film, it would have been such a big deal seeing, Mazursky and Jaglom and Bogdanovich and Hopper and all these guys, Claude Chabrol, all in one film. Whereas now it's like, that guy was in The Sopranos. Oh, and so was that guy. And try to find, 5 people that know who Henry Jaglom is. No offense to Mr. Jaglom, but it's just like, yeah, no, it's not going to happen. It's just kind of crazy.
The thing that's amazing about this film, when you look at the cast and you look at all those people, is these are people who love this man. And that's what's amazing. Like they loved him either on a personal level, but a lot of them came to that love on the personal level because of the art, because of what he did before then, and became, acolytes. They became followers and wanted to know more. And some of them actually had Orson live at their place for a while and all of that stuff. I mean, there's all of these like interesting connections when you get into it, which I know the average, even if you're an art film goer, it may not get all that. But I mean, for me, it's like the Super Bowl or something. Like if this comes out, I'm going to be just like, woo, raring, ready to go. Excited. And take a break and play a preview for next week's show.
What do you want to be in this life?
An artist, but it hasn't been working out too well.
And here is your gun.
What? I've never used a gun before in my life.
There's a hunger in man's soul that cannot be satisfied by food.
Listen, kiddo, don't you think it's time you buckled down and did something with your life? I can get you into the Columbia Art School.
No, thanks. I have to do it my way.
We never cleaned it out, and no kid. Well, you interested?
Yes, I'll take it. How much?
So, I've been working a long time to achieve a status as an artist. In Paris, they treated me better.
We're going to the Futaba. There's a very, very good conceptual installation. Life Walk 5000. It's a German conceptual artist, Klaus Wiener. He's on a treadmill counting to 1,000,000.
19, 1020, 1021, 1022, 1023, 1024, 1025.
We shall show you that New York City is a dream created by higher beings as a temporary lodging place in the earthly sojourn.
Wow. But how do I know that this isn't a dream right now?
Faith.
This way now. You see, Adam, we have these spiritual networks in most of the great cities of the world. But there is one place we haven't been able to do our work. Did I wind up singing on a bus to the moon? Must have been all them women, Mr. Fisher.
That's right. Maudit May continues with a look at Tom Schiller's Nothing Lasts Forever. We'll be joined by Mr. Schiller, Lauren Tom, Layla Nabuski, and Michael Streeter, the author of Nothing Lost Forever, a book about Mr. Schiller's work. Before we go, we want to thank this week's special guest co-host, Andrew Rausch. Andy, the last time we talked to was for our Orgy of the Dead episode. What have you been up to lately, sir?
I had a major heart surgery. So I've just been rebounding from that, but I've got several books in there, and among them, the Ed Wood book is finally coming out, which I co-wrote with Charles E. Pratt Jr. The name of that book is The Cinematic Misadventures of Ed Wood, and that is available through Bear Manor and being released in hardcover May 16th, I believe. And then I've got another book of essays called Trash Cinema, and it's got an essay by Rob St. Mary in it. How can you go wrong with that?
You can't.
So there's that, and I just finished the script for my novel, Elvis Presley, CIA Assassin, which hopefully we'll see come to fruition one of these days. But that's been my life.
Sounds good. Well, we're looking forward to those books. I mean, that Ed Wood book and, of course, the book I'm in. Thank you so much for adding me in on that. And thanks so much for adding in on the show. And thanks to everyone for listening. And hope you don't find this month's program a little too frustrating as we cover all these movies that are either difficult or impossible to see because they haven't been finished or they've been, held back in some way. But then again, what other podcast kind of has the guts to do that? We believe in you. We believe in the theater of the mind and also cinema. So we know that you're going to enjoy these conversations about these films. And if you have the guts also to continue to listen, which you're hearing my voice right now, we ask you to go over to iTunes and leave us a rating and tell your friends, to check us out either through social media or maybe old-fashioned email or send a letter to your mom and tell her that she's got to listen to this. Whatever, we just want to say thank you so much for doing that. And don't leave us lingering in the vaults forever.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.